Automatic Terminal Information Service, ATIS. At many controlled airports, there is a pre-recorded broadcast of airport information known as Automatic Terminal Information Service, ATIS. This service, which is pronounced ATIS, provides you with non-control information to help relieve frequency congestion. In other words, ATIS keeps the controller from having to repeat the same airport information, ceiling, wind, visibility, etc., over and over again to pilots landing or departing the airport. The ATIS frequency is shown on the sectional chart, along with other pertinent information about the airport. When approaching any airport with an ATIS, you should listen to the ATIS broadcast when you're approximately 25 miles from the airport. If you're departing the airport, you should listen to the ATIS broadcast prior to contacting the tower for taxi instructions. A typical ATIS broadcast might sound like this.
This is Long Beach Airport Information Hotel, 1300 Zulu weather, 1300 scattered, measured ceiling 3000 broken, visibility 4, smoke and haze, wind 230 at 10, altimeter 30.04, ILS runway 30 in use, landing and departing on runways 30 and 25 left. Contact ground control on 133.0. For runway 30, contact tower 119.4. For runway 25 right, contact tower on 120.5. Inform the controller initial contact. You have information. Hotel. Yeah.
Once again, predictability is paramount. ATIS broadcasts always contain the same information in the same order. The first few times you hear one of these beasts, it sounds like a transmission from Mars. You soon figure out that it's always airport name, followed by the phonetic designator, followed by the time, etc. In addition to basic weather and frequency information, the ATIS broadcast may have other important tidbits tagged on the end, such as taxiway closures, temporary restricted areas, birds in the vicinity, etc. One time the ATIS said there was a large, 200-foot crane south of the airport. My student looked over and said, "Wow, now that's a big bird." I immediately liberated the sandwich from his hand. ATIS broadcasts are updated when any significant change occurs at the airport or upon the receipt of any official hourly or special weather information. Each new recording gets the name of the next phonetic alphabet letter, in order. Delta becomes Echo, Hotel becomes India, etc. One time I called the controller and told him we had information Delta. He replied, "A 32 Bravo, how can you have Delta when we've just issued information Bravo?" I thought about my mistake and said, "Well, we have a psychic on board." The controller, with a bit of humor, said, "Well, perhaps your psychic can tell you what other airport will let you land." As you can see, controllers are intelligent people, often with a very sharp sense of humor. Listening to the ATIS may not be as much fun as tuning in the Super Bowl, but it can be a lot more helpful. From the ATIS you can find out if the airport is VFR or IFR, whether or not you need a special VFR clearance due to marginal weather, what direction you will be landing, whether there are any problems on the ground such as special procedures, such as ground holds due to heavy traffic in IFR conditions, and whether you have to take into account a nasty crosswind. At about 15 miles out, it's talk time. If you're approaching an airport in Class D airspace, you'll make your initial call to the tower controller. If you're approaching an airport within Class C airspace, you'll make your initial call to the radar approach control facility responsible for that airspace. An early call means you have more time to establish communication in the event the frequency is congested or the tower controller's workload prevented an immediate response to your initial call. Your initial contact with any air traffic controller should contain the following information. 1. The name of the facility you're calling. 2. Your full aircraft call sign as filed in your flight plan, if you filed a flight plan. 3. The type of message to follow, or your request if it's short. 4. The word over, if required. When contacting Long Beach Tower, your initial call should sound like this.
Long Beach Tower, Cessna 2132 Bravo, 15 miles southeast at 3,500 feet for landing with whiskey, over. The tower might reply with, Cessna 2132 Bravo, this is Long Beach Tower. Make right traffic for runway 7 right. Report entering downwind.
I was sitting at the local flight school when a student came back from a cross-country to a busy tower-controlled airport. He was obviously flustered, so I asked him what the problem was. He said, I tuned in the tower frequency and they never stopped talking. All they did was blab, blab, blab. I couldn't get a word in edgewise and finally had to return home. I asked him to point out the tower frequency on the chart. Guess what? He pointed to the ATIS frequency, between taking big bites out of his sandwich. His instructor had never taken him to an airport with an ATIS, so he knew nothing about it. I suppose if the tower ever asked him if he had the ATIS, he might have thought they were talking about some sort of a tropical skin rash. Pilot control of airport lighting. At a few very busy airports, the runway edge lights are kept on from sunset to sunrise. If you look at your sectional chart, you will notice that next to the numbers showing the airport's elevation above sea level, there may be the letter L. This indicates that lighting, specifically runway edge lighting, is in operation from sunset to sunrise. At many airports, though, you get to turn the lights on yourself. No, it doesn't take really long arms. In fact, all you need is a short thumb, because you can activate the lights by keying the microphone. An asterisk next to the lighting symbol, in other words the letter L, on the sectional chart, means lighting limitations exist. The symbol L with an asterisk means that pilot control of airport lighting is available at this airport. So don't expect to see the airport lights on at night unless you or another pilot activated them. The Airport Facility Directory will usually indicate that pilots should activate the runway lighting on the Common Traffic Advisory frequency. The words activate, followed by the specific type of lighting system, indicate the pilot control of airport lighting exists at that airport. The asterisk L symbol may also mean lighting is available on request or the lighting is part-time. If it's available on request, the AFD will identify who to contact for light activation. Always check the AFD if you see the asterisk L symbol. 3 different intensities of runway edge lighting, high, medium, and low, are available at many airports. To activate runway lighting from the cockpit, key or click the microphone button on the appropriate CTAF frequency. How many times should you click it? If all 3 intensities of lighting exist at an airport, simply click the mic 7 times within 5 seconds for the high-intensity runway lighting, abbreviated HIRL, 5 times within 5 seconds for the medium-intensity runway lighting, MIRL, and 3 times in 5 seconds for the low-intensity runway lighting, LIRL. Once activated, the lights will stay on for 15 minutes. If you're approaching the airport at night and it's approximately 15 minutes since you last activated the lights, you might want to re-click the microphone the appropriate number of times to reactivate them for an additional 15 minutes. Personally, I rekey the microphone the appropriate number of times when I'm on final approach, just to make sure the lights don't go off by surprise. Imagine being on short final when the airport disappears. Not only will this make you nervous, imagine what it'll do to the passengers. Keying the microphone more than 5 times in 5 seconds will only activate the medium intensity setting if it doesn't have high intensity capability. If high intensity runway lighting exists and it's too strong for your eyes, some pilots say you can cook chicken on the bulbs of those high intensity lights, simply rekey the mic 3 or 5 times within 5 seconds to step down the lighting system to lower intensity lighting, if it is available. The FAA suggests that when approaching an airport, you should key the microphone 7 times in 5 seconds just to activate all the airport's controlled lighting. After this, you can rekey the mic and lower the lighting intensity if medium-intensity runway lights or high-intensity runway lights are installed, or deactivate other lighting systems that may be wired into the control system. More on these other lighting systems shortly. Make it a point to activate the airport lighting when close to the field. Activating the system at high altitudes far from the airport might needlessly activate another airport's lighting systems. It may also change another pilot's light system settings while on approach. At some airports, there are 2 small stroboscopic lights near the runway's threshold. These are called Runway End Identifier Lights. The acronym is REIL, pronounced like the word real. Real lights help identify the beginning of the runway threshold, making it easier to see. New pilots are sometimes surprised at how hard it can be to spot an airport from the air, day or night.
Rekeying the mic button may allow you to step down or turn off the real system. At one airport, a tower controller called a pilot on approach and asked him if he wanted the real lights activated. The pilot replied,
"Dude, well, how can I tell the difference between the real lights and like the imitation ones?"
It wouldn't have surprised me if the controller said, "Well, I guess that all depends on what kind of sandwich you're having."
Visual Approach Slope Indicator, VASI. Under poor visibility conditions or at night, the lack of outside visual clues sometimes makes a determination of the proper landing glide path difficult. Fortunately, there is something known as a Visual Approach Slope Indicator, VASI, that provides you with a visual clue as to the proper glide path to fly. By the way, VASI is pronounced VASI. It is not something in which you put flowers. A VASI usually consists of 2 pairs of light bars along the side of the runway. It's often called a 2-bar VASI for this reason. The 2 VASI bars are usually 500 to 1,000 feet from the approach threshold. These lights project either a red or white color depending on your altitude. The colors are constant and don't actually change within the box. What changes is your height, which allows you to look at the VASI from different angles and see different colors. When you are below the proper glide slope, both VASI bars show red. Some pilots remember that this signals trouble by thinking of it as red over red, you'll conk your head. You should level off until you see red over white. Red over white means that you are above the glide path for the bar closest to you and below the glide path for the bar farther away from you. This is a complicated way of saying you're on the glide path that will plunk you down halfway between the 2 bars. A good way to remember this is red over white, you're all right. Of course, if you're too high, both bars will show white. A good memory aid for this is white over white, you'll soon be out of sight. Increase the descent rate until the upwind bar turns red. You can expect the VASI's red over white bars to transition through a pink color as your altitude in relation to the proper glide slope changes. If you see flashing red over flashing white, then you're making an approach to a police car. Now you're really in big trouble. Besides, it's not natural for the VASI bars to chase other cars down the highway. VASIs are visible from 3 to 5 miles during the day, and up to 20 miles or more at night. You can count on safe obstruction clearance for 10 degrees either side of the runway centerline when using the VASI. Obstruction clearance is guaranteed for a distance up to 4 miles along the center line of the runway. If, however, you're nearing your turn onto final approach, it's best not to start a descent using the VASI until you are aligned with the runway. Personally, I wouldn't start my descent until aligned with the runway, even if I was within 10 degrees of the runway centerline. You never know what's out there. and I'm not about to turn my aeroplane into some sort of probe whose mission is to find a newly installed obstruction. Keep in mind that regulations require you to fly at or above the glide slope when approaching a runway equipped with a VASI in Class B, C, and D airspace. Be cautious about premature descents below the glide slope. In addition to safety, VASIs aid in keeping pilots from descending over noise-sensitive areas along the flight path. Precision Approach Path Indicator, PAPI. A PAPI, pronounced PAPI, is another version of a visual glide slope indicator. No, it's not that nice guy who's paying you for flying lessons either. That's your pappy. It uses red and white signaling colors in an arrangement of 4 horizontal lights to identify the correct glide path. These 4 horizontal light units appear to change color as your glide path varies. If you're above a 3.5-degree glide slope, the poppy shows all 4 light units as white. When on a 3-degree glide slope, the right 2 lights are red and the left 2 lights are white. When below a 2.5-degree glide slope, all 4 light units show red. A pink transition between lights doesn't exist as it does with a 2 or 3 bar VASI. Tricolor VASI. The tricolor VASI is not as common as the 2 and 3 bar VASIs. It normally consists of a single light unit projecting a 3-color visual approach path into the final approach area of the runway. Red is the below glide slope indication. The above glide slope indication is amber, and the on glide slope indication is green. When the aeroplane descends from green to red, the pilot may see a dark amber color during the transition. Tricolor VASIs have a useful range of approximately 1/2 to 1 mile during the day and up to 5 miles at night. Pulsating VASI systems. The last type of the fairly common VASI systems is the pulsating VASI, or PLASI. A pulsating VASI consists of a single light unit projecting a 2-color signal to pilots in the final approach area. If you are above the glide slope, you'll see a pulsating white light. A steady white light appears when you are on the glide slope. If you're below the glide slope, you'll see a steady red indication. If you descend further below the glide slope, you'll notice a pulsating red light. The pulsating rate increases the further the airplane is above or below the desired glide slope. The useful range of this system is approximately 4 miles during the day and up to 10 miles at night, depending on the visibility. Wake turbulence. One of the unseen hazards of flight is something known as wake turbulence. This can be any form of aeroplane-generated disturbance of the atmosphere. The most common and hazardous type of wake turbulence is known as wingtip vortices. Wingtip vortices pose quite a hazard to other aeroplanes. An aeroplane caught in wake turbulence can experience a rolling motion so severe that there isn't enough control capacity to fight it. Wake turbulence can roll a small plane inverted, and quite frankly, passengers often become very upset when suddenly placed upside down in an aeroplane. If that's not enough, the rolling motions and turbulence produced by the vortices can damage aircraft components. This doesn't mean that your aeroplane is necessarily going to go to pieces upon encountering vortices, but it's a risk not worth the gamble. Wingtip vortices come not from somebody's shoes, but as an unwanted byproduct of lift. Wingtip vortices are generated by the differential pressure which exists over and under the wing surfaces. High-pressure air under the wing attempts to sneak over the tip of the wing toward the low-pressure air above. The wing's vortex starts from under the wing, moves outward, then upward, and inward towards the fuselage. The vortex appears to coil or rotate while trailing behind the wing of a moving aeroplane. Generally, the heavier the aeroplane, the stronger the wingtip vortex. There are a few exceptions to this. In other words, the vortices produced by a fully loaded Boeing 747 are a lot stronger than those of a fully loaded Cessna 152. The reason is that the pressure differential between the top and bottom of the 747's wing is a lot greater than the similar pressure differential of a Cessna 152's wing. After all, the 747 has a lot more to lift. A greater difference in pressure implies air at the wingtips rotate faster. When an aeroplane's gear and flaps are retracted, there is a tendency to produce stronger vortices. An aeroplane in this no gear and flap configuration is said to be clean. No, this isn't a newly washed aeroplane. Couple a cleanly configured aeroplane with a slow airspeed, and you've got a condition that normally produces the strongest wingtip vortices. Slow speed means a higher angle of attack, which results in a greater lift differential between the bottom and the top of the wing. Any large aeroplane that's flying heavy, clean, and slow could produce more serious wingtip vortices. As a small airplane pilot, you must watch out for airplanes that produce hazardous wingtip vortices. Some are famous or infamous as generators of these horizontal tornadoes. Beware of Boeing 747, 757, and 767s and DC-10s. Even other large aeroplanes try to avoid the vortices of these mammoth jumbos. But don't be deceived simply by the aeroplane's size. Learjets, although small in size, can produce serious wingtip vortices. Always remember that wingtip vortices are a byproduct of lift. The moment an aeroplane's wheels leave the ground, lift is being generated and vortices are produced. So expect vortices at and beyond the point of aeroplane rotation. Likewise, as soon as the aeroplane's wheels touch down, wingtip vortice production stops. If you are departing behind a larger aeroplane, it's best to lift off before the point where the aeroplane raised its nose, or rotated, and commenced climbing. Once off the ground, avoid flying into the flight path of the departing aeroplane. In a small aeroplane with limited performance, it's unlikely you will climb above the flight path of the larger aeroplane, turn right or left to avoid climbing into the larger aeroplane's departure path and its vortices. Let the tower controller know what you're doing if departing a controlled field. The unique thing about wingtip vortices is that they tend to descend at a rate of several hundred feet per minute and normally level off at 500 to 1,000 feet below the generating airplane. They also tend to remain a little less than a wingspan apart and drift with the wind. It's wise to avoid the area 1,000 feet below any large aeroplane for at least 5 miles behind its flight path.
While vortices diminish with time, as well as with atmospheric turbulence, this helps chop them up and disrupt their rotational energy. They remain a threat for many minutes after the passage of a large airplane. Vertical separation of at least 1,000 feet below the airplane can be considered safe. Personally, I'd recommend you avoid flying directly beneath and parallel to the flight path of a large transport airplane, even if you're more than 1,000 feet below it. It never makes sense to thumb your nose at any in-flight hazard.
Be prepared for vortices to drift when crosswinds exist at the airport. When vortices sink to within 100 to 200 feet above the ground, they tend to move sideways at a speed of 2 to 3 knots. A crosswind will decrease the sideways movement of the upwind vortex and increase the movement of the downwind vortex. Expect the upwind vortex to remain over or near the touchdown zone if a light crosswind component of 1 to 5 knots exists. Likewise, a light quartering tailwind can move the vortices forward into the touchdown zone. You must be especially cautious since this increases the possibility of lingering vortices in the touchdown area. Be especially cautious when departing on close, parallel runways when a large aeroplane is upwind of your runway. The vortices may drift directly into your flight path. Another area of concern is when a larger aeroplane makes a low approach, missed approach, or a go-around and flies directly over your aeroplane during the climb-out. This is most common on parallel, closely spaced runways. It's also a problem on runways that intersect at a small angle. If you experience such an event and feel the aeroplane will pass less than 1,000 feet over your aeroplane during the go-around, move out from under the aeroplane's flight path. Your job is to protect you and your passengers. Call the tower and explain that you'd like to turn right or left in the interest of wake turbulence avoidance. If it's critical, turn first, talk later. I have never been refused a request to do something in the interest of safety. In many cases, ATC will issue a caution wake turbulence warning when such a hazard presents itself. Even if ATC issues no warning, adjust your flight path as necessary to prevent encountering these dangerous wingtip vortices.
And always be prepared for the unexpected. One of Rod's friends in a Cessna 421, a twin-engine airplane, was cleared for takeoff when a small rabbit pulled out on the runway. The pilot radioed the tower that he couldn't take off until the rabbit moved. The tower replied, "The rabbit on the runway is now cleared for takeoff, and the Cessna 421, you're cleared for takeoff too. Caution wake turbulence from the departing rabbit." This is what happens when tower controllers have a lot of free time on their hands.
ATC wake turbulence separation requirements. For the purposes of wake turbulence separation minima, ATC classifies aircraft as heavy, large, and small. Heavy aircraft are aircraft capable of takeoff weights of more than 255,000 pounds, regardless of their weight during any particular phase of flight. Large aircraft are aircraft of more than 41,000 pounds maximum certified takeoff weight up to 255,000 pounds. Small aircraft are aircraft of 41,000 pounds or less maximum certified takeoff weight. For the purposes of an aircraft type rating, a large aircraft is one weighing more than 12,500 pounds.
Be especially alert to the word heavy when used by transport-type airplanes. This means the airplane can weigh over 250,000 pounds or more. And don't be fooled by the word small aircraft either. A Falcon 50 jet is a 3-engine business jet, but crikey, it packs a tremendous wake turbulence potential and it is classified as a small aircraft under these definitions.
If you're landing your small aeroplane behind a heavy jet, ATC will ensure at least a 6-mile separation exists between you and that aeroplane by the time it crosses the runway threshold. If you're following, not landing behind, a heavy jet, ATC will keep you either 1,000 feet below or at least 5 miles behind the big fellow. These distances tell you a lot about how bigger airplanes are affected by wingtip vortices. When departing directly behind a heavy jet, or when your projected flight paths will cross, ATC provides a 2-minute wait for wake turbulence, or the 5-mile separation mentioned above. ATC may state, 2132 Bravo, hold for wake turbulence avoidance. As the pilot in command, you may waive the wait if you so desire. My recommendation is don't. Do something a little less risky, like honking your horn behind a Hells Angels motorcycle gang on the freeway. Taking off from a runway intersection poses significant hazards if a large or heavy aircraft has just departed. Your departure path could put you directly into this aeroplane's descending vortices. Controllers request a 3-minute wait for wake turbulence separation in these instances. If it's a heavy aircraft, ATC won't let you waive the hold time. Ask and they'll say, "No way, Jose." Taxiing in crosswind conditions. Strong crosswinds present quite a challenge when landing as well as when taxiing. I've always felt much more comfortable flying an airplane than taxiing one. Why? Airplanes were meant to fly. Cars were meant to taxi. Frankly, airplanes are a little awkward on the ground. It's possible, with a strong enough wind, coupled with a mishandling of the flight controls, for an aeroplane to tip over, resulting in wingtip or propeller damage. If, however, you know how to position your flight controls to compensate for these strong crosswinds, your aeroplane will always remain upright. When taxiing in strong winds, the proper placement or movement of the flight controls helps you keep downward pressure on the aeroplane's wings. Remember, wind wants to lift the wing up. Your job is to keep it forced downward until you're ready to fly. When taxiing into a quartering headwind in a tricycle gear aeroplane, turn the ailerons into the wind and put the elevator in a neutral position. This forces the upwind wing down. Keeping the elevator neutral instead of back or forward keeps the nose from coming up or going down and exposing more wing surface to the wind. If you are in a tail dragger, position the ailerons in the same way, but keep the elevator stick pulled full aft. This keeps the tail wheel stuck to the ground for more effective steering. Quartering tailwinds are handled a little differently. Do you remember when you rode your first tricycle as a child? When you fell, and I know you did, you fell forward to the right or left. Tricycles are unstable in this direction. Unfortunately, a quartering tailwind tends to push in the direction the aeroplane's most unstable. Therefore, the ailerons should be positioned so that the upwind aileron is deflected downward. This aileron position allows the quartering tailwind to push downward on the upwind wing instead of lifting it and tipping the aeroplane. Applying down elevator allows the wind to push the tail down. A downward push on the tail means that the aeroplane is less likely to roll forward to the right or left. With quartering tailwinds, think of moving the controls as if you are diving with the wind. This helps you properly place the ailerons and elevator control. If you're in a tail dragger and have a quartering tailwind, keep the elevator well forward to prevent the tail from lifting. Knowing how to handle yourself around an airport is important. This chapter provides you with much of the information you'll need to successfully cope during your first solo and continuing operations. Don't be surprised if something new arises. After all, isn't that what makes flying so novel? New experiences imply new learning.
A while back, Long Beach Airport had a spectacular air show with displays of several large aircraft. One of these happened to be a C-5A Galaxy aircraft, one of the largest transports in the world. As the show ended, these large airplanes readied themselves for departure. A student pilot was number 1 in position on runway 30 for departure. He was listening on 119.4, the tower frequency. Behind him was a C-5A Galaxy whose pilots were listening on both tower 119.4 and ground control 133.0 frequency. The C-5A pilot had forgotten to load a Jeep. So the pilot called ground control, unbeknownst to the student, and requested permission to load it right there on the taxiway, while holding in the position number 2 for takeoff. C-5As load their equipment by raising the nose of their airplane and sticking out a large metal pallet that looks like a big tongue. As the student pilot looks behind him, he sees something his instructor never told him about. The student calls the tower controller and says,
"Hey, tower, what's that guy doing?"
Before the tower could respond, the C-5A pilot says,
"Hey, little buddy, we're going to eat you."
The student then said,
"Tower, what's he going to do?"
The tower replied, "Well, it sure looks like he's going to eat you, 32 Bravo." The student pilot in that Cessna 150 made one of the fastest takeoffs ever recorded in Long Beach history.
Having covered airport operations at controlled and uncontrolled airports, we'll discuss the specifics of radio communications in the next chapter. Post-flight briefing number 7-1, LAHSO, Land and Hold Short Operations. At some controlled airports, LAHSO, Land and Hold Short Operations, provides visual signage for you to land and hold short of intersecting runways, taxiways, or other designated points on a runway. 2 solid yellow lines, followed by 2 rows of dashed yellow lines, along with runway number identifiers on each side, depict the designated LAHSO hold point. A landing LAHSO clearance doesn't preclude a rejected landing, a go-around. If this is necessary, then go around, but maintain safe separation from other traffic and promptly notify the controller. A ceiling of 1,000 feet and 3 miles visibility is required for an LAHSO clearance. Student pilots should not participate in the LAHSO program. The available landing distance on an LAHSO runway is found in the AFD. It's very important that you give the controller a full readback of the LAHSO clearance. This lets the controller know that you know what's expected of you, and if you need the full length of the runway, then don't accept the clearance. Remember, you're the pilot in command. At this time, it is suggested that you review the photographs and illustrations in Chapter 7 of Rod Machado's Private Pilot Handbook. Chapter 8. Radio Operations. Aviation, spoken here. Controllers are real people, just like you and me. I'm telling you this before we start talking about talking on the radio, because the people you will usually be talking to on an aviation radio are controllers. For some reason, the simple act of communicating with one strikes terror in the heart of most student pilots. Even lawyers become speechless when asked to push and talk. Radios make us nervous because we're afraid of embarrassing ourselves. Making a mistake when speaking to controllers who sound like radio announcers seems unbearable. It's voices like those of the controllers that got Noah into boat building and gave Moses the 10 Commandments. It never fails to amaze me how normally loquacious people can become completely tongue-tied when confronted by the microphone in an airplane. I've had student pilots who, on their first attempt at radio work, just moved their mouths without emitting a sound, kind of like a large goldfish at feeding time. I usually set a 30-second limit on such behavior for my students, or they'll hyperventilate. There are actually several factors at work here simultaneously. First, new pilots usually have their brains pretty well tied up with the mechanics of handling the aeroplane. They literally have trouble flying and talking at the same time. Second, there is a definite aviation language, and at first it does sound quite foreign. Nobody wants to say the wrong thing, so some student pilots hope to get around it by saying nothing. It won't work. Communication is crucial, especially in today's increasingly controlled airspace. I'm convinced that learning to fly might be the cure for teenagers who spend too much time on the phone. Nothing will shut them up quicker than telling them they have to talk. Students, and even experienced pilots, often find it difficult to believe controllers will be non-judgmental. As a result, it's easy to become self-conscious about our radio behavior. In fact, most controllers are eager to help beginners, and they'll do everything they can to assist you, including slowing down a bit if you ask. Visit the tower and meet some real controllers. You'll see for yourself. As a courtesy, call in advance. Don't just show up and start banging on the tower. Given enough notice, they might let you plug in and listen to traffic under their control. But don't think for a second they'll let you control a few airplanes, even if you have Nintendo experience. As an added bonus, you'll gain some real insight into how the air traffic control function operates, and what can and can't be done and seen from the controller's perspective. Radio technique. Using the radio is no great mystery. When transmitting, hold the mic close to your mouth. Don't slobber on it, don't lick it, just hold it close and speak in a normal voice. Whatever you do, don't yell. You'll blast the headset off the controller's ears. Unlike telephones, aviation radios cannot transmit and receive at the same time. To transmit, simply push the microphone button and speak. To listen, you must let go of the button. With headsets, the process is the same. You simply push the transmit button to speak and release it to listen. This button, sometimes called the push-to-talk switch or PTT, is usually located in the flight control column. Be careful. Sometimes the electric pitch trim switch is located next to the radio's push-to-talk switch. One of my students accidentally confused these switches in the traffic pattern. Every time he called the tower, the aeroplane's nose dropped.
Many women and some men have high-pitched voices. The excitement of flying mixed with the anxiety of talking to controllers tends to raise such a voice an octave or two. Radios often provide another boost in pitch. You've now gone ultrasonic, and your voice is probably causing bats to fly into walls or killing cockroaches for hundreds of miles in every direction. To avoid being cited by the SPCA and shunned by others on the airwaves, it's a good idea to develop a radio voice which is deliberately lower in pitch. Emulate those deep-toned FM DJs from late-night radio. You may not believe this, but a controller once told me that he turned down a pilot's request for radar service. Something it is within a controller's discretion to do so under certain circumstances, just to keep this guy's screeching voice off the frequency. The secret to sounding like a pro on the radio is knowing what you want to say, saying it in the shortest, most efficient manner, then getting off the microphone. Brevity is the hallmark of an experienced pilot. Follow Rod Machado's law, which states, "Speak low. Tell them only what they need to know. Then let go."
Practice this by having your instructor write out on 3x5 cards all the common communication statements you're likely to encounter. If you're operating at a controlled airport, these exchanges might include calls to ground control, to the tower for departure, to the tower for entry into the pattern, etc. Operating at an airport without an operator control tower, these statements might include departing advisory, traffic pattern position calls, etc. How do you get good on the radio? Practice. Purchase a little VHF receiver. You can get them real cheap. And listen to the tower. Make recordings and listen to them over and over again. You can learn to listen and interpret at a rate 10 times the rate of normal speech with a 40% distortion of the transmission. To a student, this is exactly what controllers sound like. All it takes is practice. If you find the controllers talking too fast for you, tell them you're a student pilot. When driving down the road and seeing an automobile with "student driver" written on the side, don't you want to watch it a little closer than the other cars? If it's swerving all over the place, you're sure to keep an eye on this target. Tower controllers do the same thing with student pilots.
I prefer all my students to inform ATC that they are students by saying, "Tower, this is November 2132 Bravo, ready for takeoff, student pilot." At a local airport in California, I had a student with me who mentioned to the controller that he was a student pilot. Replying, without missing a beat, the controller said, "Hey, don't worry, I'm a student controller. We can mess each other up." Be advised, some controllers have a wild sense of humor.
VHF transmissions. Aviation transmissions are usually on the very high frequency VHF portion of the radio spectrum. Like most things in life, this has its good and less good points. Operation in this frequency range minimizes interference from atmospheric static and can provide excellent range. The downside is that the range is limited by the line of sight nature of VHF signals. There must be an unobstructed path between the transmitter antenna and the receiving antenna in order to communicate. While lower frequency signals will bend and bounce, VHF is strictly point-to-point. Line of sight limitations are one of the biggest problems pilots face in communicating. The solution is to climb. The higher you are, the less chance you'll have of some obstacle interfering with your radio's reach. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, assigns frequencies ranging from 118.0 MHz to 135.975 MHz for aviation use. Hertz is the international unit for frequency. 1 Hertz is 1 cycle per second. 1 megahertz, abbreviated capital M-H, lowercase z, is 1 million cycles per second. VHF radio frequencies are spaced at 25,000 Hertz intervals. 118.000, 118.025, 118.050, etc. All radio frequencies have 6 digits, even though it's not apparent that we're using all 6 of them. For instance, the frequency of 118.0 MHz is actually 118.000 MHz, and 118.05 is actually 118.050 MHz.
If you're using a handheld microphone, please be careful about where you place it. When it's not in use, put the mic on the hook where it belongs. When it's not being used, don't lay it between your legs. One pilot put the mic between his legs while landing at a very busy airport. Everything after that, he said, with a thigh. From base to landing, this mic man radiated his landing commentary to the world and blocked the frequency for everyone else. All the tower heard was,
"I can't believe it. What a bad landing. I'm so messed up. I'm really messed up. Oh."
Realizing what had happened, the pilot put the microphone back where it belonged. The controller said, "Aircraft that's messed up. Please repeat your call number." The pilot came back with,
"I may be messed up, but I'm not that messed up."
Talking the talk. College professors sound like college professors. Engineers sound like engineers, and pilots sound like pilots. If you are going to be a pilot, you will want to talk the talk. It won't do much in terms of providing lift for the aeroplane, but it will provide considerable lift for the pilot. If you hear the controller laughing hysterically after you've said something, it doesn't improve your pilot's self-image. By the way, they don't really laugh hysterically. As I've pointed out earlier, aviation has its own language. AvSpeak consists of acronyms, special vocabulary, and particular shorthand ways of saying things. Much of this has evolved because of the need to communicate on the radio, where it's essential to communicate a lot while saying little. You'll learn AvSpeak as you go along, but I want to provide a few basics so you can start sounding good from the get-go. The first and most important item is identifying yourself. Remember, controllers can't see you over the radio, and they hate guessing games.
You'll have to tell them who you are. Actually, they're not interested in who you are. They want to know the number of the airplane they're talking to. Controllers don't really talk to people. They talk to airplanes. So don't expect statements like, "Okay, Bobby, you're cleared to land, Bobby. And, Bobby, contact ground control after you've cleared the runway. Have a good day, Bobby."
Suppose your aircraft number is N794CT, and you want to call an ATC facility. Using the phonetic alphabet, your call would be Ontario Approach. This is Cessna 794 Charlie Tango. Over. I'll repeat that. Ontario Approach. This is Cessna 794 Charlie Tango. Over. The prefix N is dropped when the aircraft manufacturer's name or model number is stated. After initial communication is established, ATC may use an abbreviated call sign and refer to your aircraft by the prefix N and your last 3 digits or letter. In the above example, ATC may refer to you as November 4 Charlie Tango, or more commonly, just 4 Charlie Tango. Knowing how to refer to yourself on the radio is a good starting point in learning to talk AvSpeak. By the way, most aircraft have their call sign posted on a small placard somewhere among the instruments, or right above them. Many pilots fly multiple aircraft, especially instructors, so it's handy to be able to look and know who you are at the moment. When informing ATC of your altitude, aviation phraseology should be used in the following manner. I'll assume that you are flying below 18,000 feet MSL. If your altitude is 6,500 feet, state 6,500. If your altitude is 10,500 feet, state this as 10,500. If you're referring to a frequency like 125.6 MHz, it's probably stated as 125.6. Decimals are identified in the United States by the word point, which will be used for the duration of this chapter. Over is often used at the end of a transmission, although it is not essential if the context and pattern of your communication makes it obvious when you're done talking. When you use over at the end of your statements, it means that a reply is expected. It's also an effective way of telling the receiving party that you're done talking. If we were to use such language at a cocktail party, there would be much less confusion about who's still talking.
Well, Bobby, how you doing? Over? To tell you the truth there, Sammy, I'm not sure, over.
The word Roger is used to let the transmitting party know their transmission has been received. It should not be used to answer a question requiring a yes or no answer. Speaking of yes and no, these become affirmative and negative in AvSpeak. Once again, the goal is to create clarity and eliminate as much as possible any chance of confusion. No can sound like too many other words when said over an aviation radio, which degrades speech considerably, no matter how silver-tongued you are. Yes could be I guess or what a mess. When the tower says to do something and you agree that you can and will accept the instruction, the proper response is wilco, which means you have received the message, understand it, and will comply. Sometimes pilots are a little lazy and use Roger instead of wilco. I can assure you that the words Roger, Dodger are not part of the aviation communication lingo, so please don't use them. If you're carrying around any leftover CB lingo, get your ears on for a second, good buddy, and listen up. Drop it, lest you become the laughingstock of the aviation airwaves. Flight Service Station is a nice name, but a bit long for throwing around on the radio. That's why we call a flight service station radio. Hawthorne Flight Service Station becomes Hawthorne Radio on a radio call. Other ground stations have their own nomenclature. Corona Airport Unicom would be simply Corona Unicom. EFAS, En Route Flight Advisory Service, in other words Flight Watch, would be Hawthorne Flight Watch. Air Traffic Control Tower, Lambert Tower. Ground Control, Boise Ground. Clearance Delivery, Ontario Clearance Delivery. Approach Control, New York Approach. Departure Control, St. Louis Departure. Air Route Traffic Control Center, Miami Center. Then there's the matter of time. Pilots have lots of it. Zulu, or UTC, which stands for Coordinated Universal Time, is the time in Greenwich, England. Who cares? You do, because many aviation times are stated as Zulu, or just Z. Weather reports are stated in Zulu time, and the flight plans you file will give departure and arrival times in Zulu time. By using a clock in one place, pilots who sometimes cross large amounts of space in a relatively brief period won't wrestle with local time zones and conversions. When it's 0300 Zulu, it's 0300 Zulu everywhere in the world, although what it comes out to be in local time varies. Another type of pilot time is the 24-hour clock, like that used by the military. In this system, the hours of the day are numbered from 1 to 24. 1 a.m. is 0100 hours, and 1 p.m. is 1300 hours. Local time is expressed on the 24-hour clock in aviation. Of course, this can be a bit of a mystery to non-aviators. One time I was on my way out of a parking garage. The young attendant looked at my ticket, subtracted 1300, 1 p.m. when I entered it, from 1500, 3 p.m. when I was leaving, and announced the bill as 200 hours times $3 per hour for a total of $600. No checks or credit cards accepted. Ouch. There's lots more AvTalk to learn, but this will get you started. Controlled airports. As you learned in Chapter 7, some airports have control towers and others don't. The purpose of a control tower is to manage the flow of traffic into and out of the airport. The government usually installs a control tower when there is enough traffic to justify its existence. You can reasonably assume that an airport graced with a tower is, or has the potential to be, a busy place. Most towers are staffed by at least 2 controllers at any time. One to control airborne traffic, and one to control ground traffic and perform other duties. The ground controller is responsible for seeing that planes don't have any unexpected meetings on the ground, and that they don't intrude unexpectedly onto runways. That's why pilots are required to call and obtain permission, a clearance, before taxiing the airplane beyond specific areas at a controlled field. When making your initial call to ground control, you will usually have listened to the ATIS recording. You'll tell the controller you have information Bravo, if that is the current information, and he or she will clear you to taxi to the runway or some intermediate point. If it's a very large airport, you might be given a specific routing via particular taxiways.
Ground control frequencies are usually between 121.6 and 121.9. After landing, it's not unusual to hear the controller say,
32 Bravo, contact ground point 9er.
They're assuming that you know the beginning part of the frequency is 121 or 121.9. Rod realized how confusing this could be when one of his students, having just landed, taxied off the runway when the tower controller said,
32 Bravo, contact ground point 6.
The student sat there, twirling the radio's frequency dial. Rod said, Bob, what are you doing? The student replied,
Well, I'm trying to get these first 3 numbers to go away.
Rod immediately loosened his tie, thinking it might be restricting the flow of oxygenated blood to his brain.
After you've landed and taxied off the runway, don't automatically switch from tower to ground control frequency. Wait until you've been advised by the tower controller to do so. The tower controller may need you to maneuver on the taxiway to make room for other airplanes. If you're on a different frequency, you won't hear these instructions. Some busier airports have an additional person in the tower known as a clearance delivery controller. We'll explain more about this controller later in this chapter. Essentially, he or she is the person providing you with detailed instructions on how to depart that airport's airspace, typically Class C or B airspace. These instructions are necessary when specific routes or departure procedures are necessary for traffic management. Control tower communications. On an aeronautical sectional chart, CT identifies the tower frequency. There may also be an ATIS and Unicom frequency indicated. If there is a Unicom frequency for an airport with a control tower or a flight service station on the field, you can call this frequency for fuel, transient parking availability, or other general information. It's usually staffed by one of the large FBOs, fixed base operators, having fuel services on the field. If there is a small star next to the control tower's frequency, this means the tower is in operation only part-time, usually closed from late evening until early morning. At the bottom of every aeronautical sectional chart is a listing of the tower's hours of operation, ground and tower frequencies, ATIS frequencies, as well as ASR or PAR radar information for each airport. ASR, Airport Surveillance Radar, and PAR, Precision Approach Radar, are services that provide radar guidance to the very beginning of the runway. Operational hours of the tower can also be found in the Airport Facility Directory. More on this later in the chapter. McAllister Flight Service Station operates on a frequency of 122.65 MHz. Let's say you wanted to contact McAllister FSS while in flight in order to have the flight service station specialist update your VFR flight plan. You'd simply transmit and receive on 122.65 MHz and say, McAllister Radio, this is Cessna 2132 Bravo on 122.65. McAllister VOR, over. Notice that we tell the flight service station specialist what frequency we're using. Why? Unlike most tower controllers, the flight service station specialist is often monitoring several frequencies that broadcast and receive over a large geographic area. If you don't announce which one you're on, the specialist might have to try 5 buttons before finding you. Flight service station frequencies. When you see a heavy line box near a regional airport, it usually indicates the name of the nearest flight service station, as well as stating the standard frequencies for communication. Above the box are the frequencies that can be used for direct communication with the flight service station. To communicate with the flight service station directly, simply transmit and receive on the frequency listed on top of the box. Even though you might be many miles away, you'll be able to speak with them through a transmitter and receiver in the area. Another means of communicating directly with the nearest flight service station is when you will see a VHF frequency followed by the letter R on top of a VOR frequency box. The frequency above the box means that the flight service station listed under the box receives on that frequency. That's what the R stands for. Don't look for an R on the radio dial. To communicate with this flight service station, you would simply transmit on the appropriate frequency and listen on the VOR frequency inside the box. Your transmissions should go something like this. Macon Radio, this is 2132 Bravo on 122.1, listening Waycross, over. The flight service station specialist would immediately know which transmitter to use. You simply turn the VOR receiver volume up and listen to the flight service station on the VOR frequency while transmitting on 122.1 MHz. You won't find a communications frequency listed above a VOR's frequency box if that VOR station has no voice receiving capability. Underlining usually means someone is trying to attract your attention to something. A line under the VOR frequency means no voice is available on this frequency. That's why I don't have a mustache. My wife said, with a nose that big, why underline it? An RCO, Remote Communication Outlet, is a communication outlet separate from a VOR. The RCO is a remoted transmitter and receiver that connects you to a distant facility. In this instance, you can communicate with the flight service station through the RCO, even though you're some distance away. If you are near such a site, you would simply dial the frequency on your communications radio and make a call similar to the following. Riverside Radio, this is Cessna 2132 Bravo on 122.4, listening Rand Mountain, over. Give the flight service station specialist a few seconds, perhaps even a minute or longer, to establish communication. Be patient. These FSS folks may be talking with other pilots who you can't hear because they're on a different frequency.
Not knowing how to find and use all the communication frequencies available is a little like not knowing what all the dials and buttons in the cockpit do. Not smart, not safe, not fun. It's very comforting to have someone to call on when you're not certain what the weather's doing up ahead, or if your engine starts sounding a little bit unusual a million miles from anywhere. Modern communication capabilities mean you will rarely be out of calling range from someone, as long as you know how to read the available information and put it to use.
HIWAS, HIWAS, and TWEB, Tweeb. Sounds like the two guys Simon and Garfunkel wouldn't let into their band, doesn't it? When you see a VOR frequency box with a little H in the top right-hand corner, it means that HIWAS, Hazardous In-Flight Weather Advisory Service, when available, can be heard on the listed VOR frequency. HIWAS is a continuous broadcast of in-flight weather advisories. Weather advisory can be a polite way of saying you should probably be thinking about where you'd like to park the plane. One thing you will soon learn in aviation is that the flight service station will never tell you don't go or land. They don't make decisions for pilots. Hints, yes, but no decisions. They just provide information and leave it to your common sense to act in a way that will preserve your hide and that of your ever-trusting passengers. If something is happening on the HIWAS frequency, you should be all ears. You'll learn more about this in the weather chapter. For now, when you suspect bad weather, leave the VOR volume up slightly so you can listen to any broadcast of weather hazards. A VOR frequency box having a black circle with a white T, in other words a reverse bold T inside, indicates that a TWEB transcribed weather broadcast can be heard on the VOR frequency. Transcribed weather broadcasts are recorded, repeating broadcasts over selected low-frequency or VOR navigational stations. These broadcasts contain weather information for routes at or near those navigational aids. Transcribed weather broadcasts are not always available 24 hours a day, but when they are, they make good listening. I make it a point to listen to VOR's broadcasting TWEB information. It's useful, helpful, and a lot more interesting than listening to the Morse code. The emergency frequency. 121.5 MHz is the international emergency frequency. Whether you're flying in Florida or France, Iowa or Italy, a call on 121.5 will usually get you help. There is a tremendous bond between people in the aviation community, especially in times of trouble. A pilot declaring an emergency is entitled to and receives the undivided attention and assistance of anyone and everyone within radio range. This doesn't mean you must be having an emergency to use 121.5. This frequency can be used if you know of no other frequency on which to communicate with someone, though it should be used that way as a last resort. You should be able to figure out another frequency that will permit you to communicate with someone, leaving 121.5 available for a pilot who has an emergency. If you do have an emergency, 121.5 MHz is the frequency to use. Of course, this assumes you are not talking to someone else at the time of the emergency, such as a tower controller, radar controller, or flight service station specialist. In this instance, obviously it's best to stay with the person to whom you're speaking. The international distress call is Mayday, repeated 3 times. This will get the attention of everyone listening on any frequency. It goes without saying that the words "ah" screamed loudly into the microphone will also get someone's attention, but it's not as professional. Having said the magic word, you just sit back and wait. Usually help will be at hand, or ear, in microseconds. Someone will usually come to the frequency and say, "Aircraft transmitting Mayday, please identify yourself." After that, you identify and explain the nature of the problem. We'll talk more about emergencies when we get to transponders. The Airport Facility Directory, AFD. The Airport Facility Directory is a booklet published every 56 days by the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. This is kind of a guidebook for pilots. Instead of listing tacky motels and hot night spots, the AFD contains valuable information on airports, seaplane bases, heliports open to the public, communications data, navigational facilities, certain special notices and procedures, and even information on parachute jump areas and areas having glider operations.
Why would you want to know where parachute jump areas are? There's a good reason. You don't want to hit or come close to hitting one of these folks. It's bad enough they're already falling out of an airplane. You certainly don't want to frighten them. For a skydiver, as they like to be known, seeing an airplane coming at them is sort of like seeing a blender from the inside, with the blade set to dice. You will find that most pilots are appalled at the thought of deliberately jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. They can't get past the notion that the first part of the word parachute is perish.
Radar and the ATC system. When you ask anyone what the word radar means, they're likely to say something about a popular TV show from the mid-70s and early 80s. Radar O'Reilly knew what was going to happen before it occurred. In a vaguely similar way, radar allows air traffic controllers to do the same. Through the use of microwave radar energy, controllers can identify solid objects, aircraft for example, at great distances as well as determine their direction, speed, and altitude. Altitude is dependent upon Mode C transponders being equipped in the aircraft. Essentially, controllers know what these aircraft are doing beyond their ordinary visual range. Now, you can easily see the meaning behind the name radar, which stands for radio, detection, and ranging. Radar works on the echo principle. Microwave energy pulses are sent out over an antenna arrangement. Some of the energy bounces back to the originating antenna and is reported as a visual blip on a screen. Through the use of radar, controllers can identify solid objects, aircraft for example, at great distances. If all the system has to work with is the unadulterated bounce back of the radar signal, the blip is referred to as a primary return. This would let a controller know something was there, but wouldn't provide much information beyond that. Modern air traffic control is based on aircraft being equipped with transponders, which essentially take the incoming radar beam, add coded information to it, and return a stronger signal. This hyped-up bounce-back is referred to as a secondary return. It permits the identification of a specific aircraft and the display on the controller's screen of a blip that is both brighter and more informative. For a further discussion of how ATC radar works, see Post-Flight Briefing number 8-1. Transponders. On several occasions, I've mentioned the word squawk. This is official language for setting a specific numerical code in the transponder or rotating the transponder's function switch to a specific selection. In other words, if the controller told you to squawk 2154, you would set this code in the transponder's window by twisting the number code selector knobs. Then you would turn the function selection switch to the ALT position. If the controller said to squawk standby, you would move the function selection switch from the ALT position it normally rests in during flight to the SBY position. In a moment, I'll explain what these positions do. The transponder is a necessary component of the secondary radar beacon system. This little device has several interesting features. First, the typical transponder is called a 4096 code transponder because it has 4096 code combinations which can be set in the windows. Radar controllers normally assign aircraft-specific codes, but some are considered standard. For instance, if you're flying VFR, whether you are talking to a radar controller or not, you should squawk the code 1200. This allows your airplane and the 1200 code, or a symbol representing that code, like an X, to appear on the controller's radar screen. Traffic avoidance becomes easier when other airplanes in contact with the radar controller are alerted to your position. The transponder's function switch has an ALT selection, meaning altitude. This selection is useful when your airplane has an encoding altimeter, a device that tags your altitude onto the signal and sends it along as part of the transponder's return. Selecting the altitude mode allows your altitude to show up as part of the aircraft's data block on the controller's radar screen. Now the controller knows not only your position, but also your altitude. This makes it easier for him or her to inform other aircraft of your exact location. Operation in the altitude mode is also known as Mode C operation. Regulations require that if you have Mode C capability, you use it while squawking 1200 during VFR flights in controlled airspace. Sometimes controllers will ask you to squawk altitude. This means your transponder is probably being operated in the on position, and the controller wants you to turn the function switch one more click to the altitude, ALT, or Mode C position. The transponder's SBY feature, in other words, standby, is for warming up the unit. It's like warming up a car before you drive away, except the transponder doesn't produce exhaust. If it does, you need to get a new one real quick. Before takeoff, you want to operate in standby mode. As you taxi onto the runway for takeoff, switch the transponder on, the ALT position. On rare occasions, a controller may ask you to squawk standby. This most frequently occurs when your Mode C readout seems inaccurate and thus potentially confusing to controllers. The TST, or test feature, temporarily activates the transponder's reply monitor light to ensure the bulb is working and to adjust its brightness. The reply monitor light flashes when the transponder is being interrogated by a ground-based radar unit. Under the reply monitor light is the ident, or identification button. This is pushed when the controller requests that you ident. Pushing this button makes the radar blip bloom temporarily, causing it to stand out. The ident feature is simply the transponder's way of saying to the controller, "Hey look, I'm over here."
Don't push the ident button unless told to do so by the controller. It's interesting to note that when the controller tells one specific aircraft to ident, sometimes another pilot, not listening carefully, pushes his ident button. As a student pilot, I accidentally did this a number of times. If other airborne students were like me, I'm sure the controller's radar screen probably lit up like fireflies at a recharging center. Certainly, this makes it a little confusing for controllers.
The code 7700 should be used in the event of an emergency. Selecting this code in your transponder visually alerts the controller that you are in distress. Essentially, your data block lights up. making it easier for the controller to identify you. Students lost on cross-country flights have set 7700 in the transponder and tuned 121.5 MHz, the emergency frequency, on their radios and asked for help. It usually doesn't take long before someone replies on this frequency and offers assistance. Of course, if you're in an area where there is no radar coverage, the emergency transponder code won't be seen. This is one of the reasons why it's important to climb, if possible, when you're lost. It increases your chances of being seen on someone's radar as well as communicating with them.
When Rod was a student, he was never lost. Temporarily unsure of his present position, perhaps, but never lost. These days, it's more politically correct to call it location challenged instead of being lost. By the way, that's a joke. A friend of Rod's was lost and decided to land at the first uncontrolled airport he observed underneath his airplane. Rod's friend taxied up to the gas pump, got out of his airplane, and walked across the street to the hamburger joint to find out what town this was. He asked the hamburger cook, the sliced protein thermal coordinator, how he pronounced the name of this place. The fellow looked at him and said, Burger King. Ouch. After a few more questions and a Coke, he finally discovered where he was.
If you are hijacked, which is relatively rare in a Cessna 172, squawk code 7500 and tell your guest you can't go non-stop from California to Cuba. The 7500 code flashes a warning on the controller's radar screen. Of course, the controller seeing 7500 on the scope won't say, "Hey, 32 Bravo, why are you squawking the hijack code?" If the hijacker were listening, he might not be too happy with you and may request an impromptu wing-walking demonstration. There is a certain protocol controllers follow when they see 7500. Usually they ask, 32 Bravo, verify squawking 7500. In which case, if you are being hijacked, you calmly reply, Roger. Once it's established that the code selected is for real, you'll get some really incredible radar service and a very nice landing reception with guests from the FBI, FAA, and local law enforcement agencies. Another transponder code exists for pilots experiencing lost communications. Lost communications means the radio has failed, not that you have lost your voice or have gotten yourself lost. Squawking 7600 tells the controller that you've lost two-way radio capability. Normally, this code is used by IFR pilots experiencing communication failure. In other words, it's used by pilots flying in the clouds. VFR pilots, however, could also find it useful. For instance, if you were approaching an airport lying within Class D airspace in VFR conditions with a failed radio, you might squawk 7600, hoping to get the attention of the tower controller. Even if the tower controller doesn't have radar, an observant radar controller, noticing the 7600 code on his or her screen, might alert the tower controller to your problem. In this instance, you would enter the pattern and look for the appropriate light signals from the tower. Reference FAR 91.125, as we discussed in Chapter 6. When switching transponder codes, be careful to avoid switching through the codes 7500, 7600, and 7700. You don't want to trigger a false alarm on the controller's screen. Controllers have enough excitement in their lives just from the regular stuff some pilots do. Radar services for pilots. Once you're shown how to communicate with radar facilities, you'll probably want to use this service quite frequently. It offers additional eyes to help you watch for other traffic, and it can provide a useful point toward your destination airport.
Men are notoriously reluctant to ask for directions when driving. I suppose if we had aerial gas stations, we'd still be reluctant to use them for directions. Manhood and directionhood seem intimately bound. Uncouple them when you get in the air and ask the nice controller for vectors to the airport when you can't see because of poor visibility, or when you just can't find the darn thing.
He or she will be more than happy to help. Radar also provides you with location of in-flight traffic. This becomes very helpful during hazy flight conditions or in and around busy airports. When using this service, controllers call out the traffic's position using the 12-hour clock, with the aeroplane's nose being 12. If the controller says, Cessna 2132 Bravo, you have traffic at 2 o'clock, 3 miles. You start looking for traffic a bit to the right of the nose. If you see the traffic, inform the controller that you have contact. If you don't see it, say negative contact or no joy. If you don't see it and are still looking, say to the controller, looking for traffic. In other words, don't sit silently after a controller calls traffic for you. A reply is mandatory, traffic permitting. If the target aeroplane has Mode C capability, in other words the altitude encoder, then the controller will provide you with the aeroplane's altitude. Otherwise you'll be told altitude unknown. The controller might say, Cessna 2132 Bravo, you have traffic at 11 o'clock, 4 miles southbound at 3,000 feet. This clarifies how much of a concern the target aircraft is to you. If you're at 4,500 feet, then you have a reasonable separation. If you're at 3,000 feet, you really want to find that puppy, and sooner rather than later. If the traffic is a factor for you, the controller will usually continue making these calls. You can sometimes get an approximate distance by listening to the rising tone and urgency of the controller's voice. At about high C, it's time to ask the controller to vector you out of harm's way. If the traffic is not in sight, don't let the controller think you see it. Several years ago, late one evening, I heard a controller rapidly call 3 targets in a row for a pilot. Each time the controller said, Cessna 2132 Bravo, traffic at, the pilot immediately replied, contact. Suspicious, the controller paused, then said, okay, traffic at 12 o'clock. The pilot immediately said, contact. The controller said, hey, 32 Bravo, I was just kidding about that one. The pilot replied, hey, so was I. Keep in mind that the controller has no idea which way your aeroplane is pointing. All the controller can visually discern on the screen is the path the aircraft is making across the ground, in other words, its ground track. If a strong wind exists, you will be crabbed into the wind. Your nose would point in one direction, while the aeroplane moved in another. When ATC calls traffic, you must look in the general area of the traffic advisory. In other words, you must look to the right or the left of the given position. We'll discuss this in greater detail in Chapter 17. Radar assistance to VFR aircraft. Radar assistance to pilots is available in several different forms. These include 1. Basic radar service. 2. TRSA service. 3. Class C service. 4. Class B service. Basic radar service. Basic radar service is what we've been discussing. Radar controllers, on a workload-permitting basis, provide VFR pilots with safety alerts, traffic advisories, limited radar vectoring, and sequencing at specific terminal locations. The primary purpose of radar control is to provide control and separation for aircraft on instrument flight plans, in other words, IFR flights. Assistance to VFR pilots is also provided if the controller can do so without compromising the level of service to the IFR aircraft he or she is handling. If you want basic radar service after departure, Then inform ground control upon initial contact. If you're airborne and want radar vectoring to an airport, call approach control on the frequency listed on the appropriate aeronautical sectional or terminal area chart. For instance, if you were near Santa Barbara Airport, you'd simply call approach control on 120.55 MHz. Give them your aircraft call sign, altitude, position, and by the way, that's geographical, not whether you're sitting vertical or sideways in the aeroplane. Type of aircraft, the transponder code you're squawking, if you're transponder equipped, destination, and your request. If you're arriving at an airport with ATIS, let the controller know that you've received the latest information. The call might go something like this.
Santa Barbara approach, Cessna 2132 Bravo.
Cessna 2132 Bravo, Santa Barbara approach, go ahead.
32 Bravo is a Cessna 172, 4,500 feet over Gaviota VOR, squawking 1200, requesting vectors to Santa Barbara Airport. I have information whiskey.
If you aren't planning on landing and just want radar traffic information only, your call-up might go like this.
Santa Barbara approach, Cessna 2132 Bravo.
Cessna 2132 Bravo, Santa Barbara approach, go ahead.
32 Bravo is a Cessna 172, 4,500 feet over Gaviota VOR, squawking 1200, transition to the north, requesting traffic advisories.
Terminal Radar Service Area, TRSA. At certain busy airport locations, a special type of airspace known as Terminal Radar Service Area, TRSA, exists. Once widespread, TRSAs are rapidly fading from the aviation scene as they're replaced by Class C airspace. Dark gray lines represent the borders of the TRSA on an aeronautical sectional chart. If you're flying within the TRSA, you are encouraged to participate in TRSA service, although participation isn't mandatory. There is a frequency tab located on the bottom of every aeronautical chart. This tab lists the appropriate frequencies on which to call for TRSA service. We'll cover aeronautical sectional charts in greater detail in Chapter 10. TRSA service provides radar sequencing and separation between all participating VFR aircraft and all IFR aircraft operating within the airspace defined as the TRSA. Separation standards are based on one of the following: 500 feet vertical separation, visual separation between pilots, or target resolution, a process controllers use to keep radar targets from touching. Now, that's a good idea, isn't it? If you are asked to follow another aircraft into or out of the TRSA, you are responsible for maintaining a safe distance behind the aircraft. In other words, don't get close enough so that you can watch the in-flight movie in the other airplane. If you suspect wake turbulence could be a problem, give yourself more room. Even though ATC applies greater distances between large and small airplanes for wake turbulence separation, ask for more if you feel it's necessary. You are the pilot in command.
Here's an important caveat about TRSA service. As you're being vectored by ATC, be cautious about adhering to the required VFR minimums relating to clouds and altitude requirements. Remember, ATC's radar doesn't show clouds. Clouds aren't solid and don't show up on the screen. The controller simply can't tell if the heading he or she gives you will put you in a cloud. Since you're not instrument rated, you can't be in the clouds. Avoid them. Immediately ask for an amended clearance, a new heading. If your present one will take you into a cloud. Even if ATC hasn't given you a new heading, turn as necessary to avoid flying into that cloud. The best thing to do is keep the radar controller advised of the weather conditions along your route if it looks like clouds or other obscuring phenomena are a problem.
Sometimes when arriving or departing a TRSA, I prefer obtaining radar advisories from ATC, but not having the formal separation efforts that TRSA service entails. In this case, I'll state negative TRSA service on my initial call-up with approach control or ground control as appropriate. This becomes especially important when departing. Suppose, barring any departure restrictions, you wanted a straight-out departure after takeoff. We'll assume this heads you directly toward your destination. If you don't say negative TRSA service on your initial call-up, the controller might have you call departure control after takeoff. Now, the radar departure controller, thinking you want TRSA service, could give you vectors that are anything but the shortest direction to your destination. These types of delays are most common at busy airports on busy days. When departing the TRSA or any other class of airspace, the controller will sometimes say, Cessna 2132 Bravo, radar service terminated. Don't take it personally. This either means you are leaving the boundaries over which the controller exercises control, or the controller is too busy to continue providing service. Either way, this is your clue to squawk VFR by setting the code 1200 in your transponder. Since you're no longer being given radar service, the controller has no need to keep you on a specific code or his or her frequency. Class C service. In Chapter 9, you'll learn about Class B and C airspace. For now, understand that these airspace types belong to increasingly busy airports with operating control towers. Class C service provides basic radar service, separation between all IFR and VFR aircraft, and sequencing of the VFR arrivals to the primary airport. Class B service. Class B service provides basic radar service, separation between IFR and VFR aircraft, and sequencing of VFR arrivals to the primary airport. If you want to know what stage of radar service is available at an airport, simply look in the Airport Facility Directory. Clearance delivery. Some airports lying within Class B or C airspace require you to have a clearance prior to departure. In this type of airspace, you will generally be assigned very specific routing and altitude directions, as well as a frequency on which to make contact with a controller after a handoff from the tower. Since you have to know before you go, that means getting a clearance from somewhere. The somewhere is called clearance delivery. A special frequency exists with a controller awaiting your call and request for a clearance. If there is a clearance delivery frequency, it will generally be part of the ATIS broadcast. The information can also be found in the communications section of the Airport Facility Directory. At some less busy airports, ground control functions as a clearance delivery. When you contact clearance delivery, give them your complete aircraft number, tell them you have the current ATIS information, give them your destination and direction of flight, and tell the controller you're a VFR aircraft. A typical call may sound like this.
Palm Springs clearance delivery, Cessna 2132 Bravo.
Cessna 2132 Bravo, go ahead.
Cessna 32 Bravo with information hotel, VFR to Ontario, over.
A typical clearance out of a busy airport may sound like this. Cessna 2132 Bravo, after departure fly heading 230 degrees, climb and maintain 3,500 feet. Departure control frequency will be 124.3. Contact ground control on 121.9 when ready to taxi.
It's customary to read back clearances to controllers to ensure the accuracy of the communication. Sometimes this makes pilots a little bit nervous, especially if the controller spoke at 60 knots, fast, with peak gust to 90 knots, that's real fast, and the clearance wasn't copied in its entirety. One fellow, after receiving a rapid-fire clearance, picked up his microphone and said, very slowly, "Hey, fellows,
Do you hear how fast I'm talking? Well, this is how fast I listen.
The controllers laughed and repeated his clearance slowly. If you have trouble understanding the clearance, ask the controller to slow down. One of these days, some pilot is going to record his clearance with a portable recorder and play it back to the controller as his readback. I'm sure the controller, after hearing his own clearance, will say,
"Hey, 3-2 Bravo, you're going to have to speak a little slower if you want me to understand any of that." Gotcha.
Well, I've been promising you for quite a while that we're going to begin studying airspace. It's time to pay off on that promise. The next chapter is all about airspace and how it works. I hope you are ambitious enough to learn all you can about airspace. It's the one area in which I find pilots to be consistently in need of further study. Understanding how the airspace is arranged and what you can and can't expect in each kind of airspace is absolutely vital to a safe flight. Fasten your seatbelt. Here we go. Post-flight briefing number 8-1. How ATC keeps an eye on you. Radar is the air traffic controller's eye on the sky. A radar antenna sends out a microwave-length radio signal. Encountering a solid object, these energy pulses bounce back to the originating antenna, where they are identified and converted to visual blips on a radar scope. One of my students said, "How can the same pulse bounce off an airplane and return to the antenna if the antenna has rotated slightly?" My student didn't quite understand that electromagnetic pulses travel out and back at 186,300,000 miles per second. That's millions of miles per hour. A rotating antenna doesn't have much of an effect on the radar return. The target's distance from the radar antenna is determined by the signal's round-trip time, based on the known speed of light. Visual radar blips are called primary radar returns. Primary radar was the basis of early radar detection, but primary radar was inefficient since smaller targets, those with a less reflective surface, were often difficult to identify. Weather, suspended water or ice, often interfered with target identification. With advances in technology, we now use something known as secondary surveillance radar. This system is known officially as the Air Traffic Control Radar Beacon System, or ATC-RBS. Essentially, secondary surveillance radar is a separate system from primary radar, because it uses an aircraft's transponder to identify aircraft. A transponder is similar to the bell on a cow. Farmers hear the bell and know the location of the cow, which is also why cows can no longer play their favorite game called "Let's Sneak Up on the Other Cows." Transponders provide an electrical signal that the radar unit hears, in other words receives, to determine your position. With the secondary radar beacon system, the ground-based radar sends out a coded signal, which is received by the transponder, modified, then transmitted back to the radar unit, where it's decoded by the ground facility. This allows ATC to identify your airplane among many other targets on the radar scope, based on the specific 4-digit discrete transponder code the controller assigned you. If you are told to squawk a transponder code of 4312, you set those numbers in the code selection window, then turn the transponder function to the ALT position. Controllers watching the scope might see your airplane as a secondary radar return in the form of a blip, also known as a data block, with numbers alongside. These numbers might be 4312, your assigned code, which makes it easy for the radar controller to identify you. Depending on the controller's type of radar equipment and the mode selected, The radar screen may show your ground speed, altitude, and aircraft call sign alongside the blip. Another advantage of the secondary system is that non-useful, scope-cluttering information can selectively be edited out. Strangely enough, scope clutter could be in the form of freeway traffic near the radar antenna. If it weren't for the secondary radar beacon system, the controller might have to visually ignore these extraneous targets. These targets don't show up on the secondary beacon's system screen because they don't have transponders. Therefore, you'll never hear ATC say,
3-2 Bravo, you have a U-Haul truck at 12 o'clock, opposite direction. Turn right for avoidance vector. And watch out, those guys make wide right turns.
Radar is truly ATC's eye on the sky. It permits large volumes of traffic to move safely and efficiently. Which is not to say ATC radar is perfect, far from it. Most radar facilities are using sadly outdated equipment driven by computers that should be in museums. A multi-billion-dollar upgrade effort in the mid-90s bogged down in bureaucratic inertia, and the FAA is now scrambling to find a way to bring its system up to snuff as quickly as possible. At this time, it is suggested that you review the photographs and illustrations in Chapter 8 of Rod Machado's Private Pilot Handbook. Chapter 9. Airspace. The wild blue, green, and red yonder. In this chapter, we're going to discuss how the airspace in the United States is constructed. We'll concern ourselves with the weather minimums and equipment requirements when flying in several varieties of airspace. I'll do my best to simplify the subject and make myself perfectly clear. When one of my early flight instructors asked if he had made himself perfectly clear, I wanted to run my hand up and down behind him and say, "Hey everyone, come here, look, Bob's perfectly clear now." Airspace rules sound and look worse than they are in practice. The fact of the matter is that 99% of the time, 99% of the pilots will need to know only a handful of basics. Some of what you're about to hear covers situations that, quite honestly, are not very prevalent. You need to be aware that certain rules exist, though, so you'll know when it's time to refresh your memory. Bright student of aviation that you are, you might be asking yourself useful questions like, why? Why is it so complicated? Why are there so many rules? Why do I care? You care because the airspace structure is there to assure the maximum safety for everyone. Knowing where you can fly and under what conditions is essential to keeping yourself, your passengers, and lots of other people healthy and happy. You also care because I guarantee you that this stuff will show up on all the FAA aeronautical knowledge exams you ever take, both computerized and oral.
I've got one more question. Why is the V formation of ducts longer on one side than the other? Well, of course, one side has more ducts. Despite the asymmetrical display of our fine feathered friends, they're pretty good at keeping themselves from bumping into one another. They are their own air traffic control system. This is all the more remarkable when you consider that they have slightly less mental computing power than an Etch-a-Sketch. Well, what can happen even if a few ducks were to collide? What's the worst that can happen? Some ruffled feathers, a headache resulting from a duck coming in on a wing and a bear.
Pilots, on the other hand, can't afford a collision. Megatons of metal hurtling through the air at enormous speeds means any encounters will be of a very unfortunate type. Let's see how that can be avoided. I see. Our modern airspace system has evolved to protect you, the pilot, from bumping into other aircraft and various solid objects, mountains, trees, antennas, etc. This is accomplished by having rules that determine how and where you can and can't fly under given conditions. The rules vary depending not only on weather conditions, but also on the type of airspace in which you're flying. In order to maximize safety, the airspace has been divided into different types of areas, which generally reflect how busy that patch of airspace is, and thus how demanding the flying is within it. Once upon a time, these had names like Airport Traffic Area and Terminal Control Area. They've been renamed with snappy titles like Class A, B, C, D, and E airspace. These are simple, but they're not too descriptive. By whatever name, your job as a pilot is to know at all times what kind of airspace you're in and what its rules are. Anytime you are flying, you will be operating under one of two primary sets of rules: Visual Flight Rules, or VFR, or Instrument Flight Rules, IFR. Generally speaking, VFR flight is fair weather flying based on the concept of being able to look out the window and see any obstacles or other aircraft at all times. IFR is flight when clouds, fog, rain, dust, and other kinds of natural phenomena reduce visibility. IFR flight is, of course, more demanding. It requires additional training for the pilot in the form of an instrument rating, and additional equipment for the aeroplane. A VFR flight is a pretty hang-loose proposition. No flight plan is required, although it is suggested. You can get from hither to yon via any route you want, and you don't need to talk to anybody except perhaps tower controllers at your departure or arrival airport. IFR, on the other hand, is a tightly controlled exercise. You file a flight plan prior to departure, in which you propose a very specific route, including altitudes based on electronic highways in the sky. You receive a clearance, which may contain modifications to your proposed route, and you follow it from takeoff to landing, communicating constantly with air traffic controllers on the ground. With rare exceptions, you are under constant radar surveillance. The exact flight visibility and required distances from clouds for VFR flight vary, depending on the type of airspace in which you're flying. In other words, flying in busy airspace requires greater flight visibility and distance from clouds than flying in less busy airspace. These minimum requirements, known as basic VFR weather minimums, allow you ample time to see and avoid other aircraft. See and avoid is the basis of all VFR flight. When you can't see and avoid, you're no longer flying VFR. Keep that in mind, please, because far too many needless accidents occur every year in which pilots qualified only for VFR flight continued on into bad, in other words, IFR weather, and created business for a metal salvage dealer. You might be wondering, what keeps an IFR pilot from popping out of a cloud and bumping into a VFR pilot? A VFR pilot, adhering to the minimum distance from clouds and flight visibility requirements, should have adequate time to see and avoid an IFR aircraft emerging from a cloud. That's why, in the types of airspace used by IFR pilots, the basic VFR weather minimums make collisions highly unlikely. This assumes, of course, that pilots are looking out their windows and making an effort to see and avoid other aircraft. Controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Two basic types of airspace exist in the United States: controlled and uncontrolled. The major difference between the two can be distilled down to one very important point. Controlled airspace is likely to be used by more aircraft, especially aircraft on IFR flight plans, than uncontrolled airspace. That's why controlled airspace typically has greater cloud distance and flight visibility requirements than uncontrolled airspace. Doesn't that make sense? After all, if more airplanes use controlled airspace, the risk of a collision is higher. It's a numbers game. Greater flight visibility and cloud distance minimums make it more likely that pilots will see and avoid each other. Uncontrolled airspace, on the other hand, is less active. It's normally found close to the surface, away from busy airports, and in areas devoid of airways. Airways are the electronic highways I mentioned earlier, on which IFR flights are conducted and along which many VFR pilots also navigate. Since uncontrolled airspace is used less often, you can typically fly in this airspace with a lower flight visibility and cloud distance minimums.
If you ever watched fish in an aquarium, you'll agree they swim around completely confused. It's a little-known fact that if they think at all, it's to contemplate whether the Almighty is really an enormous nose that occasionally appears overhead and always precedes the sudden and inexplicable appearance of fish food falling from the sky. It's obvious the fish can't understand anything because they don't have the big picture. Rod don't want you to suffer the fish's dilemma. So, Sammy, let's look at airspace from the big picture, just for the hell of it.
The big picture. Figure 1 represents the big picture overview of the National Airspace System. Don't be alarmed. This will all make a great deal of sense to you soon. And we won't need to do a Vulcan mind meld to get you through this. As you can see, the airspace is made up of several layers, shapes, and sections. Each layer or section has a letter designation of either A, B, C, D, E, and G. Yes, I know, the F is missing. That's because there is no F-type airspace in the United States. Because the people in charge didn't want any, that's why. Class A, B, C, D, and E is controlled airspace. Class G is uncontrolled airspace. Your job is to know the minimum flight visibility, cloud distance, aircraft equipment, and pilot qualifications for each class of airspace. With the use of an aeronautical sectional chart and a little knowledge, it's easy to identify the weather minimums needed for any class of airspace. Just because the designations for airspace run from A to G, less F, doesn't mean we need to learn about them in alphabetical order, and a fair argument can be that taking them out of order actually makes more sense. Let's try this. We'll start with Class A at the very top, then move on to Class E, then Class G airspace. There's a method to my madness, at least this portion of it. Class A airspace overlies Class E airspace, which, in turn, overlies Class G airspace. Class A airspace. Class A airspace consists of controlled airspace extending from 18,000 feet MSL up to and including 60,000 feet MSL, reference Figure 2. This airspace stretches from coast to coast with an additional 12 nautical mile extension over ocean waters. Flight in Class A airspace requires that you have an instrument rating and be on an IFR flight plan. Why? Let me put it this way. When you're flying at and above 18,000 feet, you're flying where the heavy metal usually goes. Think about two 300,000-pound aeroplanes closing in on each other at a closure rate of 1,000 knots or more. See and avoid becomes something of a moot point. At this level, what keeps the metal monsters apart is flight plans and air traffic control, the nice people at the radar screens. At and above 18,000 feet MSL, we don't refer to altitudes with MSL values. All pilots flying in Class A airspace set their altimeters to 29.902 inches of mercury, rather than local station pressure. These altitudes are referred to as flight levels, abbreviated FL, as shown in Figure 3. Class A airspace starts at 18,000 feet MSL and officially tops out at flight level 600, or 60,000 feet. Add 2 zeros onto the flight level value to obtain the 5-digit altitude value in feet. There's a good reason pilots don't use local station pressure at and above 18,000 feet. Imagine the pilot of a jet aircraft, flying at hundreds of miles per hour, having to reset the altimeter to the local station pressure every 100 miles or so. That pilot would be changing numbers in the altimeter's window faster than a teenager channel surfing with TV's remote control. This pilot would need carpal tunnel surgery after each flight. It was decided that all pilots flying in Class A airspace would simply agree to use 29.902 as the altimeter setting and revert back to local station pressure when below 18,000 feet. At least everyone operating at and above 18,000 feet MSL is flying by the same altitude reference. As a nice bonus, flight at and above 18,000 feet MSL will clear all terrain in the United States with the exception of Mount McKinley in Alaska. With a few exceptions that ATC handles, pilots can set their altimeters to 29.902 at the transition altitude of 18,000 feet MSL and not worry about terrain. Since Class A airspace doesn't come anywhere near the surface, it's not designated on any aeronautical sectional chart. In other words, the only way you know you're in Class A airspace is when your altimeter indicates 18,000 feet. Frankly, the only time I can imagine someone unintentionally stumbling into Class A airspace is when they're flying the family's F-16 and accidentally hit the afterburner switch.
Up to this point, we've only discussed the performance of civilian airplanes. Military airplanes also use the airspace system. Often, they operate secretly at high altitudes doing their own thing. Several years ago, a radar controller at Los Angeles Center had an experience with a military pilot flying an SR-71 Blackbird. The aircraft is so fast and flies so high that its performance is still classified. Even the controllers don't know how high it flies. The pilot of this SR-71 called the controller and said, "LA Center, this is Blackbird 431 Charlie. Request flight level 850, 85,000 feet.
Hey, 431 Charlie, if you can get up there, you can have it.
We'll be coming down to flight level 850. Now that's performance, punk."
Class E airspace. The airspace lying directly below Class A airspace is Class E airspace. Reference Figure 4. Class E airspace overlies the 48 United States and Alaska, including a 12 nautical mile extension off the coastline. Class E airspace is controlled airspace, implying that quite a few pilots are likely to use it. It's made up of airways, commonly flown routes, and those areas between busy airports. You'll probably do the majority of your flying in Class E airspace, so let's cover it thoroughly. After all, if you use something regularly, you should know a lot about it, shouldn't you? Unfortunately, I have a friend who regularly eats at a Mexican restaurant, but still doesn't know the proper Mexican names for food. He ordered a burrito and asked the waiter if it came with any Guatemala on it. It's actually called guacamole. The waiter said, "No, sir, but I do have some Nicaragua and conquistador that is mighty tasty." it pays to learn all about the things you use. Figure 5 provides a better understanding of the vertical structure of Class E airspace. This figure shows a plot of land over which lies Class E airspace. The Class E airspace in this figure starts at 1,200 feet AGL. Note that this is above ground level, not above sea level. Where there are hills or mountains, Class E airspace starts at 1,200 feet above the variable rising and descending surface as shown by position number 1. Class E airspace can also drop down to 700 feet AGL, as shown in position number 2. Class E airspace can also descend all the way down to the surface around an airport. When Class E airspace touches the surface, it's identified by a dashed magenta line in the shape of a circle, possibly with rectangular attachments as shown at position number 3. In just a while, I'll explain why it drops down to the surface and why this airspace is shaped the way it is. For now, our objective is to understand what Class E airspace means to you as a pilot. To do that, let's divide Class E airspace into 2 sections, a section at and above 10,000 feet MSL, and a section less than 10,000 feet MSL. Class E at and above 10,000 feet MSL. To operate VFR in Class E airspace at and above 10,000 foot MSL, you need the basic VFR minimums shown in Figure 6. You're required to operate at least 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile to the side, horizontally, of any cloud formation. This means that if you see a cloud directly in front of you, you must maneuver to climb over it by at least 1,000 feet, go below it by at least 1,000 feet, or go to the side of it by at least 1 statute mile, in other words, 5,280 feet. You're also required to have a minimum of 5 statute miles of flight visibility at all times. These minimums make it easier for you to see and avoid other, and possibly faster, aircraft. Here's Rod Machado's Airspace Simplification Rule number 1. If you're flying at and above 10,000 feet MSL, you could find fast jet fighters like the F-111. This reminds you the minimum flight visibility is 5 F. Statute miles and the minimum distance above, below, and to the side of a cloud is 111, or 1,000 feet above, 1,000 feet below, and 1 statute mile to the side, or, to make this easy to remember, just think 5V/111. You may be wondering, how do I know when I'm 1 statute mile to the side of a cloud? Good question. You must take your best guess. The reason you are required to be 1 statute mile horizontally from a cloud at these altitudes is to prevent being hit by an emerging IFR aircraft. If you're at or above 10,000 feet MSL and a jet traveling at 450 knots, for example, on an IFR flight plan, pops out of a cloud, your entire vocabulary would be reduced to 2 words: bad thing. Do you have any idea how scary it is to look out your window and see a jet coming directly at you at 450 knots? It's probably as scary as having Stephen King as a flight instructor. Being at least 1 mile to the side of a cloud provides you with a better chance of seeing and avoiding other aircraft. One way to make a practical judgment on distance from clouds is to always ask yourself, if a jet were to pop out of there at about 500 knots right now, aimed directly at me, would I have time and space to do something about it? With that thought in mind, you should always have sufficient clearance from clouds, and it will be a heck of a lot more than 1 mile. Since there is no aircraft speed restriction at and above 10,000 feet MSL, jets and other fast-flying aircraft typically move at or near their top speed. Over land, however, jet pilots must avoid flying faster than the speed of sound. If you're breaking the sound barrier in your Piper Cub, please send me a little note with information on what power setting you're using. Class E below 10,000 feet MSL. Most recreational flying is done below 10,000 feet MSL. It's not that our aeroplanes can't fly higher than this, but the performance of the majority of general aviation aeroplanes drops off pretty rapidly as you get above 10,000 feet. For short flights, it's just not worth the time and fuel it takes to fly high. Figure 6 shows the VFR cloud distance and flight visibility minimums below 10,000 feet MSL. Any altitude in Class E airspace below 10,000 feet MSL requires that you fly at least 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally from any cloud formation. 3 miles of flight visibility is also required. Here's Rod Machado's Airspace Simplification Rule number 2. Since you're likely to see at least 3 Cessna 152s below 10,000 feet, let's encode the minimums in an easy-to-remember formula: 3V/152.
Why are the cloud distance and flight visibility minimums below 10,000 feet MSL less than those at above 10,000 feet MSL? There is a 250 knot, 288 miles per hour indicated airspeed limit for all aircraft operating below 10,000 feet MSL. A 250 knot airplane could still pop out the side of a cloud and you'll be as shocked as a pig seeing someone eating a ham sandwich. Maintaining a distance of no less than 2,000 feet horizontally from any cloud formation minimizes the risk of a collision. To repeat for a good cause, stay as far away from any cloud as you need to do in order to feel really, really safe. 2,000 feet might not do it for you. It certainly doesn't do it for me. I prefer 3, 4, or even 5,000 feet. Big feet too.
Why is a greater distance required above a cloud than below? Many high-performance aeroplanes typically climb faster than they descend. Small jet aircraft, like Learjets, can climb at several thousand feet per minute after takeoff. Learjets feel like someone strapped a little rocket onto your back. Being higher above the cloud tops helps reduce the risk that you will unintentionally become a hood ornament for a Learjet. Pilots of jet aircraft, particularly big ones, rarely descend at thousands of feet per minute when they are below 10,000 feet MSL. Why? Trying to arrest a 6,000 foot per minute sink rate in a fully loaded Boeing 747 would take hundreds of feet. Boeing 747s, also known as aluminium overcasts, have such inertia that descents in excess of 1,000 feet per minute while close to the ground are done with great care. Since pilots generally descend at lesser values than they climb, required distances below clouds are typically less than those above. The minimum flight visibility of 3 statute miles is less than that required above 10,000 feet. Once again, because of the speed limit, somewhat less margin is acceptable. Allowing more than the minimum is certainly the wise thing to do. Class E airspace starting at 700 feet AGL. When Class E airspace starts at 700 feet above ground level, it will be surrounded by a magenta faded line as shown in Figure 7. Anywhere within this magenta faded area, controlled airspace starts at 700 feet AGL. Outside the border of a magenta fade, Controlled airspace starts at 1,200 feet AGL. An aeronautical sectional chart shows this magenta faded border quite clearly in Figure 8, Position 1. Within the borders of the magenta fade at and above 700 feet AGL, Rod Machado's airspace simplification rule number 2 applies. In other words, you need a minimum of 3 V/152 for VFR flight. Why would an airspace designer want to lower Class E airspace to 700 feet AGL around or near an airport? To keep VFR pilots from bumping into IFR pilots who are making instrument approaches. The keyhole type extensions of Class E airspace starting at 700 feet AGL in Figure 8 identify descent paths followed by IFR aeroplanes during their instrument approaches. The keyhole slot is shown on the aeronautical sectional chart excerpt in Figure 8, Position 1. IFR pilots on an instrument approach typically descend to altitudes of 700 feet AGL and lower. They remain in Class E airspace during most of their IFR approach. If they see the airport, they land. If they don't see it, they fly off to another airport, hopefully one that has fewer clouds and better visibility. Remember that in Class E airspace below 10,000 feet MSL, VFR pilots should be flying with no less than 3 V/152. This means if an IFR pilot pops out of the clouds, there should be ample time for the VFR and IFR pilot to see and avoid each other. IFR pilots are equally responsible to see and avoid whenever they are not in instrument meteorological conditions. Some airports have instrument approaches that bring IFR pilots down closer than 700 feet AGL, as shown in Figure 9. There are airports allowing IFR pilots to come within 200 feet AGL or less while still in the clouds. Since controlled airspace helps VFR pilots see and avoid other pilots, these airports have Class E airspace lowered all the way to the surface. There may be other reasons why controlled airspace is lowered, but these are beyond the scope of this book. Figure 10 shows how surface-based Class E airspace is shown on an aeronautical sectional chart. A dotted magenta line defines the lateral boundaries of the controlled airspace surrounding Macomb-Pike County Airport, Position 1. Airports without air traffic control towers use a magenta-dashed line to represent this surface-based Class E airspace. Airports with established control towers, as you'll see a little later, use blue dashed lines to represent controlled airspace in contact with the surface around that airport. What does this surface-based Class E airspace mean to you as a VFR pilot approaching and departing Macomb-Pike Airport? It means Rod Machado's airspace simplification rule number 2 applies all the way to the surface, within the boundaries of the magenta-dashed line. The only thing different here is that the controlled airspace normally existing at 700 feet or 1,200 feet AGL drops to the surface, within the boundaries of the magenta-dashed line. Additional requirements in surface-based controlled airspace. There are 2 additional requirements when operating at an airport having any type of surface-based controlled airspace established for it. Class E in the case of Macomb-Pike. 1. The reported ground visibility at the airport must be at least 3 statute miles. If the ground visibility isn't reported, then the flight visibility during takeoff, landing, or when operating in the traffic pattern must be at least 3 statute miles. The flight visibility is always determined by the pilot on the honor system. 2. If a ceiling exists at that airport, it can be no lower than 1,000 feet AGL if you desire to operate beneath it. If you want to take off, land, or operate in the traffic pattern, the ceiling, if one exists, must be at least 1,000 feet AGL or more. A ceiling is defined as the height above the Earth's surface of the lowest layer of clouds reported as broken or overcast, or any reported vertical visibility into obscuring phenomena. We'll be talking more about these terms in Chapter 13. For the moment, consider a ceiling as being anything in the sky you can't readily see through, like clouds, for instance.
To summarize these requirements, remember this. To operate to, from, or at an airport within the boundaries of any surface-based controlled airspace, you need a minimum of 3 miles reported visibility, flight visibility if none reported, and no less than 1,000-foot ceiling, if a ceiling exists. Let's symbolize these basic VFR requirements as 3V/1C. As you will soon see, in addition to Class E, there are 3 other types of controlled airspace that surround an airport at the surface: Class D, C, and B. Here's Rod Machado's Airspace Simplification Rule number 3. Taking off, landing, or operating in the traffic pattern of an airport having any type of surface-based controlled airspace requires basic VFR minimums of at least 3 miles visibility, and if a ceiling exists at that airport, it can be no lower than 1,000 feet. We'll symbolize this rule as 3V/1C.
I specifically chose the words above to indicate that surface-based controlled airspace is established for a specific airport, usually the one in the center of that airspace. We call this the primary airport. Sometimes other airports lie within the boundaries of the primary airport surface-based controlled airspace. These are called satellite airports. Think of them as orbiting the primary airport, although they don't really move. As you'll soon see, the above simplification rule number 3 also applies to satellite airports, with one exception. Just because Class E airspace exists at the surface of an airport doesn't mean it stays that way 24 hours a day. In other words, the surface-based portion of that controlled airspace can revert back to Class E airspace starting at 700 or 1,200 feet AGL. Normally, any type of surface-based controlled airspace requires a federally certificated weather observer or weather observing system be present to make visibility and cloud height determinations. These weather observers or observing systems can be tower controllers, flight service station personnel, licensed weather observers, or federally certificated automated weather observing stations known as AWOS-3, AWOS-3, Automatic Weather Observing System. Some means of pilot to ATC communication is also required. Either direct communications with ATC, relayed communications through a flight service station, or communications via a remote communication outlet is acceptable. The official weather observer's hours of operation normally coincide with the hours during which the surface-based controlled airspace exists. I said normally, not always. The actual hours that surface-based controlled airspace exists are depicted in the AFD, the Airport Facility Directory, as shown in Figure 12. If the weather observer leaves before these hours, the surface-based airspace is still in effect. This is one reason why ground visibility might not be reported, yet 3 miles of flight visibility is still required for landing. Special VFR clearance. What happens if you want to land or depart Macomb Pike Airport, and the reported ground visibility is less than 3 miles, or the ceiling is less than 1,000 feet? Do you circle, eating a sandwich, until the cows come home or the clouds blow away? not necessarily. You can request something known as a Special VFR Clearance, abbreviated SVFR, from the nearest ATC facility. This is permission to operate within the surface-based controlled airspace at less than basic VFR minimums. A Special VFR Clearance allows you to operate below 10,000 feet MSL down to the surface within the lateral boundaries of the surface-based controlled airspace, Class E airspace in the instance at Macomb Pike, under the following conditions. 1. The pilot must have a clearance from ATC. 2. The reported ground visibility by the official weather observer must be at least 1 statute mile. If the ground visibility isn't reported, then the flight visibility must not be less than 1 statute mile. 3. The pilot must remain clear of all clouds and maintain 1 mile flight visibility. Despite the lowered visibility that SVFR permits, this is considered a safe operation from the perspective of ATC. Since ATC is responsible for providing separation between aircraft during SVFR conditions, they usually allow only 1 aircraft to operate within the lateral boundaries of the surface-based controlled airspace at any one time during special VFR operations. Remember, SVFR applies to any surface-based controlled airspace, Class E, as well as 3 other types of airspace we have not yet discussed, B, C, and D. The whole purpose of SVFR is to get into or out of an airport that's surrounded by surface-based controlled airspace when the weather conditions are less than basic VFR minimums. This clearance is not intended to let you fly to a far-off destination halfway around the globe with a minimum of 1 mile flight visibility while remaining clear of all clouds. The SVFR clearance is only applicable within the horizontal boundaries of the vertically extended surface-based airspace at that airport as shown in Figure 13. The Special VFR clearance is only good below 10,000 feet MSL unless ATC assigns a lower altitude restriction.
Special VFR is a very handy tool, and when used properly, a safe one. It is the answer to the phenomena observed by every pilot that if there is 1 cloud in the sky, it will hang over the airport. You can use Special VFR to depart or arrive at an airport when there is some local obscuring phenomena such as fog, haze, or low clouds, and the en route weather is above basic VFR minimums for the airspace in which you'll fly. Let's examine how you can go about getting a Special VFR clearance.
Obtaining a SVFR clearance. Special VFR clearances are usually obtained by contacting the nearest ATC facility, tower, flight service station, approach or departure control. For instance, let's suppose the reported ground visibility at Macomb Pike is 2 miles and you need to obtain a SVFR clearance. You can obtain this clearance by calling the flight service station located on the field at Macomb Pike as shown in Figure 10. The letters FSS indicate that a flight service station is located at that airport. The flight service station specialist would contact the ATC facility in charge of the surface-based controlled airspace, Class E in this case, at Macomb Pike and obtain an SVFR clearance for you. Since no control tower exists at this airport, the nearest approach and departure control or air traffic control center will normally have jurisdiction over this airspace. The clearance may sound something like this. Cessna 2132 Bravo is cleared to climb to VFR within the Class E surface area within 4 miles of Macomb Pike Airport. Maintain special VFR conditions until reaching VFR. Report reaching VFR. This is a typical special VFR clearance issued when conditions of restricted visibility exist near the airport. When cleared for takeoff, you must maintain at least 1 mile flight visibility and remain clear of clouds within 4 miles of Macomb Pike. The assumption is that you will reach VFR conditions, in other words 3V/152 when operating below 10,000 feet MSL, by the time you depart the controlled airspace. An altitude limitation may be given in a special VFR clearance when it's necessary to keep you separated from IFR traffic in the vicinity of the airport. For example, ATC may issue the following SVFR clearance. Cessna 2132 Bravo is cleared to maintain special VFR conditions at or below 2,000 feet within the Class E surface area of Macomb Pike Airport. By the time you reach 2,000 feet, it's expected that you will be in VFR conditions. If not, the clearance forbids you to continue your climb in special VFR conditions. If you haven't reached VFR conditions by 2,000 feet, you should contact the ATC facility responsible for that airspace and request further instructions. In this instance, I would ask ATC for my special VFR clearance to be amended with a higher altitude restriction. If you were approaching Macomb Pike Airport and the reported ground visibility was 2 miles, you could call the flight service station and request a special VFR clearance into Class E airspace. The clearance might sound something like this. Cessna 2132 Bravo is cleared into Class E airspace from the west towards Macomb Pike Airport in special VFR conditions at or below 2,500 feet. Maintain SVFR conditions until reaching Macomb Pike. Now, don't go out and fall on your sword or throw yourself in front of an onrushing glacier, but student pilots are limited in the SVFRs they can obtain. Student pilots can't fly when the ground or flight visibility is less than 3 miles during the day and 5 miles at night, no exceptions. Students can, however, obtain a clearance for special VFR operations when the ceiling is less than 1,000 feet. I'm not recommending that you do this either. Let your flight instructor be the judge of this. Check and see if he or she will allow such activity.
No pilot, student or otherwise, can obtain a special VFR clearance from sunset to sunrise unless they have an instrument rating and an airplane equipped for instrument flight. This obviously means no special VFR at all for student pilots at night. Clouds are difficult to see at night, making them much easier to accidentally fly into. An instrument rating provides good assurance for special VFR operations at night in case you accidentally fly into a cloud.
Satellite airports lying within the primary airport's surface-based controlled airspace. Sometimes an additional airport, a satellite airport in other words, lies within the surface-based airspace originally established for another airport, in other words the primary airport. Port Angeles, figure 14, is an example of such an airport. It lies within the Class E surface area established for Fairchild International Airport. If Fairchild reports less than 3 miles visibility, a special VFR clearance isn't required for operations at Port Angeles as long as the pilot has a minimum of 3 miles flight visibility or ground visibility if it's reported at the satellite airport. However, if Fairchild, the primary airport, reports a ceiling less than 1,000 feet AGL, then a special VFR clearance is required for operations anywhere within that surface-based controlled airspace. Simply stated, visibility is determined by pilots on the honor system, but ceilings are determined by the official weather observer at the primary airport. This rule pertains to any type of surface-based controlled airspace. This includes B, C, D as well as E. Figure 15A and 15B provide a quick summary of the VFR weather minimums for flight in Class E airspace. Class G airspace. We're about to do much ado about nothing. Welcome to the short course on Class G or uncontrolled airspace. This is a tiny sliver of airspace whose rules are thicker than its depth, and whose practical importance to most pilots on most occasions is vanishing unless you routinely fly from point A to point B at or below 1,200 feet above the ground. While there are several types of controlled airspace, Class B, C, D, and E, for example, there is only one type of controlled or Class G airspace. It's generally found below Class E airspace at altitudes less than 1,200 feet or 700 feet AGL. Figure 16 depicts Class G airspace. In fact, the only place near the surface where you won't find Class G airspace is within the surface-based controlled airspace that surrounds an airport. Think about Class G airspace as a thin layer of water resting over the entire continental United States. In other words, any place other than an airport having surface-based controlled airspace must have a thin layer of Class G airspace lying on top of it. Those airports having surface-based controlled airspace in the United States couldn't possibly cover even 1% of the nation's surface. Believe me when I say it's much, much less than that, but we'll use 1% anyway. Simple math indicates that over 99% of the United States surface must have Class G airspace lying on top of it and extending vertically to 700 or 1,200 feet AGL. As you can imagine, Class G airspace within 700 or 1,200 feet AGL is quite common. That's why it's nice to know something about the basic VFR minimums in Class G airspace. To understand what Class G airspace means to you, it's necessary to think back to the introduction of this chapter. Our airspace discussion revolves around the idea that controlled airspace is likely to be used by more aircraft, especially aircraft on an IFR flight plan, than uncontrolled airspace. Therefore, the basic VFR weather minimums are stricter in controlled airspace. Have you noticed how the basic VFR weather minimums change with altitude? Generally, the lower you go, the less restrictive the weather minimums become. At low altitudes, say less than 1,200 feet AGL, fewer aeroplanes, and certainly fewer fast aeroplanes, fly close to the surface for long periods of time, except for taking off and landing at airports, of course. There is less threat of a collision at these lower altitudes between airports. With fewer aeroplanes flying long distances at low altitudes between airports, it's reasonable to conclude that the VFR weather minimums in these areas should be the least restrictive. This is precisely the case. In Class G airspace at and below 1,200 feet AGL, the basic VFR minimums for daylight operations are 1 statute mile flight visibility while remaining clear of clouds, as shown in Figure 17. We'll simplify this with the symbol 1V/COC. COC stands for clear of clouds. Monette Airport, shown in the Aeronautical Sectional Chart excerpt in Figure 18, Position 1, is in Class G airspace. During the day, you may depart or land at Monette with a minimum flight visibility of 1 mile while staying clear of all clouds, as long as you remain at or below 700 feet AGL. Class E airspace starts at 700 feet AGL within the magenta faded borders above Monette, Position 2. For flight above 700 feet AGL, within the magenta borders lateral limits, you must have the basic VFR minimums for Class E airspace operations below 10,000 feet MSL, in other words, 3V/152. Outside the lateral limits of the magenta fade, at what altitude does Class E airspace start? I hope you said it starts at 1,200 feet AGL as shown in Figure 16. Let's assume you want to take off or land at Mount Vernon Airport, Position 3, Figure 18. You can do so during the day with a minimum of 1 mile flight visibility and remaining clear of clouds, as long as you ascend no higher than 1,200 feet AGL. Climbing higher than 1,200 feet AGL above Mount Vernon puts you in Class E airspace, which requires 3V/152.
Most pilots do not routinely fly around 1,200 feet AGL or below. That's because most pilots realize there's not much margin of safety in case of engine failure when you're at 1,200 feet AGL. There's a good chance of bumping into something tall, like a basketball player or a TV antenna. And you probably couldn't convince the FAA that this met the standard for sensible altitude when over a densely occupied area. For these reasons, and many others, Class G airspace is not something in which you will spend a lot of your pilot life. In fact, you'll probably spend more time trying to memorize the rules about Class G airspace than you will using them to fly within such airspace.
Remember, the airspace designations and the basic VFR weather minimums for each are there for a reason, to protect you and other pilots. Rules are often created for just that purpose. In fact, that's why you now see little signs on Coke machines saying, "If you lose money in this machine, don't shake it. Call the manager." Apparently, people without much common sense were shaking the machines, causing them to tip over and squish these folks graveyard dead. If you've been injured by a falling Coke machine, you probably shouldn't be flying an aeroplane. I always check for Coke imprints on the forehead before I fly with anyone. Night operations in Class G airspace at 1,200 feet AGL and below. To offer you additional protection, the FAA has established slightly stricter basic VFR minimums at night in Class G airspace. If you are operating in Class G airspace at or below 1,200 feet AGL from sunset to sunrise, the Class E, less than 10,000 feet, airspace minimums apply. In other words, 3V/152. Why the increase in basic VFR minimums at night? Simply stated, it's more difficult to see and avoid objects when it's dark outside. Perhaps that's how Neanderthals received their sloped foreheads, by walking into stationary objects at night. If they were around today, they'd probably be found under Coke machines. The additional flight visibility and cloud clearance minimums lessen the risk the pilots will hit terrain, obstructions, or other aircraft when it's dark. Figure 17 also depicts the minimums for night operations in Class G airspace at or below 1,200 feet AGL. One exception to nighttime minimums exists for airplanes operating in Class G airspace while in the traffic pattern. If the flight visibility is less than 3 statute miles, but not less than 1 statute mile during night hours, an airplane may be operated clear of clouds if it is flown in the airport traffic pattern within 1/2 mile of the runway. The assumption is that if a pilot is close to the runway, it's unlikely that he or she will hit an obstruction. Here's Rod Machado's airspace simplification rule number 4. When flying in uncontrolled airspace at or below 1,200 feet AGL during the day, you're low enough to knock over one Coke machine. COC sounds like Coke, and end up wearing a night E. Therefore, the weather minimums for Class G airspace below 1,200 feet AGL during the day are 1 mile visibility and remain clear of clouds. At night, they become the same as for the Class E airspace directly above, 3V/152. At this point, you know more about Class E and G airspace than most pilots will know throughout their entire career. That's the truth. You could skip the following section dealing with Class G airspace above 1,200 feet AGL and probably never have a need for the information. Nevertheless, I challenge you to master this subject. If you do so, you'll become a guru. Pilots will sacrifice headsets and training aids in your honor. Hobbs meters will run slower in your presence. Most of all, I'll be proud of you for the attempt. Operations in Class G airspace above 1,200 feet AGL. Class E airspace begins at 700 feet AGL within the magenta faded area as shown in Figure 19, Position 1. Directly outside the magenta fade, Class E airspace begins at 1,200 feet AGL as shown by Position 2. How do I know this? Because these positions are all surrounded by a blue-tinted line that fades in one direction and has a solid border on the other, Position 3. The blue tint fades in the direction where Class E airspace begins at 1,200 feet AGL. This is shown by the direction of arrows marked by the number 4. On the other side of the blue-tinted line, opposite the direction that it fades, is Class G airspace. Normally, Class E airspace begins at 1,200 feet AGL, but not in those areas shown by Position 5. Here, Class G airspace actually rises vertically to more than 1,200 feet AGL, as shown by the direction of the white arrow pointing toward the area of Position 5. In fact, Class G airspace in this area rises up to, but not including, an altitude of 14,500 feet MSL, as shown in Figure 20. This is an approximate 3D representation of Figure 19. Now, I must admit that Class G airspace extending more than 1,200 feet AGL is rare in the central and eastern United States. It is, however, more common in the western and north-central parts of the United States. The way to find it is by looking for the border of the blue-tinted line on aeronautical sectional charts, Figure 19, Position 3. On the opposite side of the blue fade will be Class G airspace extending more than 1,200 feet AGL. Despite the presence of Class G airspace more than 1,200 feet AGL, it's a reasonable assumption that most of your flying will be done in Class E airspace. Okay, I've pushed you where no mammal has gone before, beyond normal vertebrate endurance. So why stop now? I only have one last thought for you. We've already concluded that Class G airspace above 1,200 feet AGL is not very common. Why not make it all Class E airspace, starting at 1,200 feet AGL over the entire United States? The reason is that air traffic control can't use some portions of the airspace above 1,200 feet AGL for IFR flights. In other words, there's no way to use the navigational facilities, VOR navigation for instance, because of restrictions imposed by other types of airspace, navigation station limitations, or, as is frequently the case, by terrain-created signal limitations. There is an interesting point here. The highest mountain in the 48 United States is Mount Whitney, at 14,491 feet MSL. If you're at or above 14,500 feet MSL anywhere in the United States, you're not likely to have a problem with mountains interfering with navigational signal reception. That's why Class G airspace, more than 1,200 feet AGL, extends up to but not including 14,500 feet MSL, as shown on the left-hand side of Figure 20. At and above 14,500 feet MSL, it's Class E airspace, at least until reaching the base of Class A airspace. General conclusions about Class A, E, and G airspace. Here are some general conclusions that make understanding VFR minimums easier. First, the lower you go, the less restrictive the weather minimums for VFR flight. Figure 22. In Class A airspace, at and above 18,000 feet MSL, there's no VFR flight allowed. How much more restrictive can you get? Below Class A airspace and at or above 10,000 feet MSL, the flight visibility minimum is 5 miles. Below 10,000 feet MSL, the visibility minimum drops from 5 miles to 3 miles, then finally to 1 mile within Class G airspace next to the surface, assuming daytime. Cloud clearance minimums also become less restrictive at lower altitudes. Second, at night, Class G airspace minimums increase to those of Class E airspace. In other words, if you're flying VFR at night in Class G airspace, you need the same VFR minimums as you do in Class E airspace for similar altitudes. Frankly, if you like to fly long distances at night at 1,200 feet AGL or less, you should probably be wearing a vacancy sign on your forehead, right above the Coke imprint. Third, when flying at and above 10,000 feet MSL, while higher than 1,200 feet AGL, the VFR weather minimums are the same, regardless of whether you're in Class E or Class G airspace. Here's Rod Machado's airspace simplification rule number 5. If you're flying more than 1,200 feet AGL and your altimeter indicates 10,000 feet MSL or higher, the basic VFR minimums are the same, regardless of the class of airspace in which you're flying. 5V/111. Additionally, at night, all Class G basic VFR minimums become the same as Class E minimums for similar altitudes. You might be wondering, do all pilots who fly remember all these rules? Yes, in varying degrees. What's perhaps most important is that you are aware they exist, so you'll at least think to check in situations where there might be a question. A pilot with a good understanding of airspace seldom finds him or herself in trouble with the FAA. Not only will you impress other pilots with your practical knowledge, you'll sail right through those flight reviews and phase checks. It's also the case that the vast majority of pilots do not spend much time flying around VFR in marginal conditions, so the precise letter of the law about VFR minimums doesn't really come into play for them on all that many occasions. If you want to fly in marginal weather conditions, please get an IFR rating and use it. You'll be flying more often and more safely. Several years ago at an FAA office in Santa Monica, a student was taking the private pilot knowledge exam. This was his third attempt, having failed on his first 2 tries. The airspace section gave him trouble. Finally, this student decided to cheat. The observing FAA inspector became suspicious when he noticed that the student kept opening and closing the bread on his bologna sandwich. Walking quickly into the testing room, the inspector attempted to catch the student in the act of cheating. The inspector testified he had never witnessed anyone eating a bologna sandwich so fast in his life. When the inspector asked the student why he shoved an entire bologna sandwich into his mouth, the student replied, "A sudden surge of hunger came over me." Considering the state of intelligence of this fellow, the inspector should have simply provided him with a few bent quarters and told him to go get a Coke. Class B, C, and D airspace. The last 3 variations of controlled airspace are Class B, Class C, and Class D airspace. All 3 types of airspace start at the surface and surround those airports which have an operating control tower. Each class of airspace serves the single purpose of coordinating takeoffs and landings between individual aircraft. That's why an operating control tower is required. Geometric versions of these three different types of airspace are shown in Figure 23. In Chapter 6, we referred to Class D and C airspace as having the shape of a single and double-stacked tuna can. We referred to Class B airspace as looking like an inverted wedding cake. Now it's time to upgrade this simile to an analogy.
Now you see, Ope, it's safe to generalize here and say that the taller the airspace structure, the busier the airport with which it is allied. The word busy implies more as well as bigger and faster airplanes. A good way to understand how big and small airplanes operate within these three types of airspace is to think about fish. If you have goldfish, you put them in a small bowl. Well, they certainly don't need a large living area. But sharks, on the other hand, need bigger aquariums. Whales need giant tanks. Airplanes are like fish, and that larger ones need more space in which to operate. Boy, those sharks are selfish. They just swim around thinking of number one.
Think about these three airspace shapes as aquariums or water tanks, Figure 24. Class D airspace is small in comparison, meaning most of the time that the smaller aeroplanes, goldfish like Cessnas, Pipers, and Beechcraft, swim there. Class C airspace, being slightly larger, means that bigger and faster aeroplanes like Learjets and Boeing 737s, Sharks, may be found there. Class B airspace, big tanks, means that aircraft like Boeing 747s and DC-10s, Whales, may loom within this airspace. Let's examine each class of airspace, starting with Class D, the Goldfish Bowl.